A $4.2 million hypercar dies in an industrial wasteland. A homeless engineer offers salvation. A billionaire chooses fear over faith and has 9 minutes to undo everything he thought he knew about power, worth, and who deserves a second chance. If you're watching from your city right now, whether it's New York, Lagos, Mumbai, or anywhere between, drop your location in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, because what happens next isn't just about one car or one man. It's about every brilliant mind we've thrown away, and what happens when desperation finally forces us to see them. Now let me take you to that moment, the one that changes everything. The Quantum Apex hypercar had been engineered to humiliate physics itself. Carbon titanium monocoque chassis, plasma-cooled quad motor architecture, 0 to 60 in 1.8 seconds. A rolling monument to human ambition, wrapped in obsidian paint that cost more per ounce than most people earned in a month. And right now, in a forgotten corner of Detroit's industrial corridor, it was dying. Damian Cross stood beside the open engine compartment, watching blue-gray smoke curl into the October morning like the death rattle of his entire empire. His reflection wavered in the car's glossy surface, 6'2", silver-threaded hair, a face that had graced Forbes covers and TED stages. The architect of Cross Technologies, the man who'd turned thermal engineering into a $16 billion fortune, the genius who, at this precise moment, had absolutely no idea what was killing his flagship vehicle. "Talk to me, Chen." Damian's voice carried the clipped authority of someone accustomed to solutions, not mysteries. Chen Wu, his chief engineer, straightened from the diagnostic panel, his face the color of old concrete. "The secondary cooling loop is failing. Coolant's contaminating the tertiary chamber. If the bearing seizes, I know what happens if the bearing seizes." Damian checked his Patek Philippe. "I'm presenting this car to the Sovereign Wealth Consortium in 2 hours and 47 minutes. They're flying in from Abu Dhabi specifically to see it. 300 million in Series D funding rides on them believing this technology works. So I'll ask again, can you fix it?" Chen's silence was answer enough. Behind them, the warehouse district sprawled like a graveyard of American manufacturing. Skeletal factories, shattered windows, weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. This had been the location Damian's PR team selected for the photo shoot. Innovation rising from industrial ruin. The symbolism had seemed perfect 12 hours ago. Now it felt like prophecy of a different kind. Marcus Webb, head of Damian's security detail, appeared at his elbow. 6'4", former Secret Service, a man whose job was anticipating threats before they materialized. "Sir, we've got a situation. Unless it involves a thermal engineering miracle, I don't want to hear it." "It's about the crowd." Marcus gestured toward the chain-link fence, where the photo shoot had attracted the inevitable audience, urban explorers, car enthusiasts, and the neighborhood's homeless population, drawn by the spectacle of wealth invading their forgotten territory. "One of them is trying to approach, says he can help with the car." Damian didn't look up from the diagnostic screen. "Tell him I'm not signing autographs today." "He's not asking for an autograph. He's insisting he knows what's wrong with the vehicle, getting pretty agitated about it." "Then have him removed." Damian's patience, already threadbare, snapped clean through. "I don't have time for this circus." But even as he spoke, a commotion erupted near the fence. Raised voices. Someone was shouting technical specifications, not in layman's terms, but in the precise language of thermal dynamics. Damian's head snapped up. "Not a coolant leak, you idiots. It's a microfracture in the secondary loop housing. The plasma ionization is creating cascading pressure differential." The voice belonged to a black man in his late 40s, pressing against the chain link with an intensity that made the security guards flanking him step back. He wore layers despite the mild weather, a threadbare peacoat over a hoodie, jeans stained with city grime, boots held together with duct tape. His beard was salted with gray, his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness or worse. Everything about him screamed threat assessment to men like Marcus Webb. Everything except the words coming out of his mouth. "Who the hell is that?" Damian moved toward the fence. "Homeless guy," one of the security guards said, hand on the man's shoulder, ready to pull him away. "Been hanging around since we set up. Won't leave." I'm not leaving because you're about to destroy a $60 million prototype. The man's voice cracked with frustration. The microfracture is allowing coolant to leak into the tertiary chamber at approximately 2.3 milliliters per minute. At current rate, you've got 12 minutes before bearing temps hit critical threshold, 14 minutes before catastrophic seizure. You try to drive that car, the entire motor assembly will weld itself into a 1,200-pound paperweight. Chen appeared beside Damien, his phone still displaying the internal diagnostics. His face had gone from concrete to chalk. Sir, that's almost exactly what our sensors are showing. How could he possibly— Call the police, Damien said quietly. Now. The homeless man's eyes met his across the 20 feet of cracked asphalt. They weren't the eyes of someone desperate or delusional. They were steady, sharp, and filled with something that looked unsettlingly like recognition. You don't remember me, the man said. I wouldn't expect you to. But I remember you, Mr. Cross. I was in the back of the auditorium when you gave that keynote at the Thermal Engineering Symposium in 2019. You talked about how the industry had to stop gatekeeping genius, how brilliance could come from anywhere if we were brave enough to look. A bitter smile crossed his face. I actually believed you. Damien's jaw tightened. He turned to Marcus. Get him out of here. Wait. Chen grabbed Damien's arm. Sir, if he knows the specific failure point, he's guessing, or he sabotaged it himself. Either way, I'm not letting some random vagrant near a $4 million vehicle based on lucky guesses shouted through a fence. Damien checked his watch again. 11 minutes had just become 10. We're calling the manufacturer. Get their emergency team on the phone. They're 8 hours away, Chen said. Even their remote diagnostics take— I don't care what it takes. Make it happen. But as he turned back toward the quantum apex, its gleaming surface now dulled by the thickening smoke, Damien felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The cold weight of genuine helplessness. All his money, all his connections, all the brilliant minds on his payroll, none of it mattered if that bearing seized in the next 9 minutes and 30 seconds. My name is Caleb Mercer. The voice from the fence cut through the chaos with unexpected steadiness. 15 years ago, I was the lead thermal engineer for the Helios 7 cooling system, the one your quantum platform is based on. I designed the secondary loop architecture you're using, every calculation, every stress test, every failure scenario. He paused. Including the one that's killing your car right now. The words landed like a physical blow. Damien turned slowly. Chen was already pulling up records on his tablet, fingers flying across the screen. Helios 7, that was the space tech project. It became the foundation for 3 major aerospace contracts. I used those specifications myself when we— He stopped, eyes widening. Sir, there was a Caleb Mercer listed on the original patent filing. Lead engineer, but his name was removed in subsequent filings. There was some kind of— I don't remember the details. Scandal is the word you're looking for, Caleb said quietly. Though railroading might be more accurate, but that's a longer conversation, and you've got about 8 minutes now. Damien's mind was racing through calculations of risk versus reward, pride versus pragmatism, the potential costs of being wrong versus the certain cost of doing nothing. The logical part of his brain, the part that had built a billion-dollar empire on brutal rationality, was screaming that this was insane. You don't hand over your company's future to a homeless man making wild claims through a chain-link fence. But there was another voice, quieter but more insistent. The voice of the young engineer he'd been once, before the money and the magazine covers, when he'd been the one fighting to be heard in rooms that didn't want to listen. What do you want? Damien heard himself ask. Caleb's expression didn't change. Nothing. I want to fix your car before you lose everything you've built on top of my work. Because, despite what you probably think right now, I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in not watching another brilliant piece of engineering die because of pride. He could be anyone, Marcus said in Damien's ear. Could be planning to vandalize the vehicle, damage your reputation. Could be exactly who he says he is, Chen interrupted. Sir, I'm looking at the Helios 7 documentation right now. The system architecture matches our current specs almost exactly. If he really was the lead engineer, then why is he homeless? Damien's question cut through the air like a blade. He moved closer to the fence, studying Caleb's face, looking for the tell, the crack in the performance, the desperation that would give away a con. He saw none of it. Why is a thermal genius sleeping on the streets instead of working for NASA or Tesla or any of 100 companies that would kill for that expertise? Something flickered across Caleb's expression. Not anger, but something deeper and more tired. Because 15 years ago, I reported a safety concern on a military contract. The concern turned out to be valid. The system failed during a test flight, nearly killed 6 people. But the company needed a scapegoat, and I was the only black engineer in a senior position. So they blamed me for the initial design flaw, stripped my name from the patents, and made sure I'd never work in the field again. Industry blacklist, reputation destroyed, license suspended pending an investigation that never quite concluded. He shrugged. After that, it didn't matter how brilliant my ideas were. Nobody wanted to take the risk. The words hung in the October air like an indictment. Around them, the film crew had stopped working. The security guards shifted uncomfortably. Even the other homeless individuals watching from the fence had gone quiet. That's horrible, Chen said softly. But sir, even if his story is true, we can't just— 7 minutes, Caleb said, looking at his own watch, a battered Timex that had probably cost $30 new. The fracture is propagating. You're losing 0.4 milliliters per minute more than you were when I started talking. Pretty soon your sensors will confirm what I already know. You're past the point of safe operation. If you try to start that car, you'll be replacing the entire motor assembly. And since Quantum Corp only manufactures them in batches of 12, with a 6-month lead time, you'll miss your presentation, you'll miss your funding round, and whoever's waiting in line behind you to buy the company for scrap will send you a lovely thank you note. Damien's hands clenched. The man was either a savant or the most convincing con artist he'd ever encountered. Why should I trust you? Give me one reason, one fact I can verify right now that proves you're who you say you are. You want verification? Caleb straightened, his voice taking on a different quality, not pleading, but professorial. The microfracture isn't just a structural failure. It's a design flaw in the secondary loop housing that I tried to fix before I left the industry. The housing uses a titanium aluminum alloy, specification TA7, right? Developed specifically for thermal cycling in extreme environments. Beautiful material. Except it has a crystalline grain structure that develops microscopic stress fractures at approximately 50,000 thermal cycles. The fractures are invisible to standard inspection, only show up under electron microscopy. You've probably run this car through about 60,000 cycles in testing. Chen was frantically cross-referencing data on his tablet. His face went from skeptical to stunned in the space of 5 seconds. That's exactly the material spec, and our cycle count is 63,402. How the hell? Because I wrote the original engineering report warning about exactly this failure mode, Caleb said. It's in the archived space tech documentation under Project Helios Addendum 7C, dated March 2018. I recommended switching to a modified TA9 alloy with different grain structure. Would have added about 12% to manufacturing cost. Company decided the risk was acceptable for the contract duration. His eyes locked onto Damien's. Apparently it's still acceptable, right up until your bearing seizes in 6 minutes and change. The world seemed to contract to this single moment, this impossible choice between everything Damien had built his identity on and everything he claimed to believe about merit and innovation and second chances. The cameras were still rolling. His team was watching. Marcus had his hand on his radio, ready to call in reinforcements. The quantum apex continued its death rattle, smoke now thick enough to make Chen cough. And this stranger, this ghost from a buried scandal, this man society had decided to forget, stood on the other side of the chain-link fence with steady eyes and steady hands, offering salvation or destruction, and Damien had exactly 5 minutes and 43 seconds to decide which one it was. Marcus, Damien said finally, open the gate. Sir, open it, now. The security chief's jaw tightened, but he moved toward the fence. The lock clicked. The gate swung open with a metallic shriek that sounded like a judgment being rendered. Caleb didn't rush forward. He didn't show triumph or relief. He simply nodded once, then walked toward the dying hypercar with the steady gait of a man returning home after a long exile. I'll need three things, he said, kneeling beside the open engine compartment. Your emergency repair kit, a very specific type of pencil, drafting pencil, graphite grade 4B, and everyone to step back about 15 feet. This is going to involve venting contaminated coolant, and I'd rather not explain to your insurance company why half your crew has chemical burns. We don't have time for, Damien started. 5 minutes? 20 seconds, Caleb interrupted, already examining the exposed cooling system with the focused intensity of a surgeon over an open chest cavity. I can do it in 4 if you stop arguing. Chen, that's your name, right? I need you on the diagnostic panel. When I tell you, you're going to manually override the pressure relief valve. Timing has to be perfect, or we'll blow the tertiary seals. Chen looked at Damien. Damien, breaking every protocol he'd ever established about chain of command and security clearance, nodded. Tell me what you need. What happened next would be described in news articles and YouTube breakdowns and engineering forums for months afterward. But in the moment, it felt less like innovation and more like watching a master craftsman return to a familiar instrument after years of silence. Caleb's hands moved through the quantum apex's guts with absolute certainty. He identified the microfracture, invisible even to Chen's trained eyes, by touch and sound, listening to the subtle harmonics of stressed metal like a musician identifying an out-of-tune string. He located the emergency sealant in the repair kit, rejected it as insufficient, then did something that would later seem either insane or inspired depending on who was telling the story. The graphite pencil, he said. Someone handed it to him. He broke it open, extracted the graphite core, then began shaving microscopic layers of it into a small container from the repair kit. Mixed it with 3 precise drops of the emergency sealant. Created something that looked like liquid shadow. What are you doing? Chen breathed. Making a nanobond compound. The graphite will fill the crystalline fracture at the molecular level. The sealant will cure around it, creating a temporary matrix that'll hold for about 500 cycles. Maybe 800 if you're lucky. Caleb was already applying it to the fracture point with a cotton swab from the first aid kit, his hands absolutely steady despite the countdown. It's not permanent. You'll need to replace the housing, but it'll get you through your presentation. Chen, what's the bearing temperature? 147 Celsius. Critical threshold is 150. Time. 3 minutes, 42 seconds. Caleb didn't respond. His entire being was focused on the microscopic seam where the impossible repair was either taking hold or about to fail catastrophically. The compound glistened in the morning sun, black and strange and entirely too simple to actually work. Pressure relief valve, Caleb said suddenly. Override. Now. Chen's fingers flew across the diagnostic panel. A hiss of escaping vapor, sharp and chemical. The smoke changed character, became clearer. The temperature gauge on the screen held steady at 147.3 Celsius. Refused to climb. Contaminated coolant is venting through the emergency bypass, Caleb said, still not looking up from his work. Fresh coolant from the reserve tank is backfilling the tertiary chamber. Pressure differential is equalizing. Bearing temperature should start dropping in about 20 seconds. The crowd had pressed against the fence, filming everything on phones. A dozen amateur documentarians capturing what might be either a miracle or a spectacular failure. The professional camera crew, initially frustrated by the delay, had redirected their equipment toward this unexpected drama. Damien stood motionless, watching his entire empire balance on the edge of a graphite and sealant compound, being applied by a man in duct-taped boots. Temperature's dropping, Chen said, his voice barely above a whisper. 146, 144. Oh my God, it's actually working. It'll work, Caleb said simply. The question is whether your pride will let you admit it. He stood, wiping his hands on a rag someone handed him, and faced Damien. Up close, the years showed in ways they hadn't from across the fence. The weathered skin, the lines around his eyes that spoke of too many nights in places humans weren't meant to sleep. The slight tremor in his hands that faded only when they were working. But his eyes were clear, uncompromising, waiting. Start the engine, Caleb said. What if you're wrong? Then you'll be exactly where you were 3 minutes ago, with a seized bearing and no options. But I'm not wrong. Start the engine. Damien moved to the driver's seat like a man approaching an altar or a gallows. The carbon fiber door lifted with its signature whisper. He settled into the hand-stitched leather, placed his hand on the biometric starter. Temperature stabilized at 138 Celsius, Chen called out. Pressure optimal, coolant flow nominal. All systems reading green except… He paused. Cooling efficiency is at 70% of spec. The fracture repair is holding, but it's not perfect. It's not supposed to be perfect, Caleb said. It's supposed to work. There's a difference. Damien pressed the starter. The Quantum Apex 4 electric motors whispered to life with their characteristic harmonic hum. Not the roar of combustion engines, but something purer and more alien. The diagnostic screens blazed with data. Power flowed through superconducting pathways. The plasma cooling system, moments ago on the verge of catastrophic failure, stabilized at operating temperature. The smoke stopped. The death rattle faded to silence. The crowd erupted in applause and shouts. Someone was crying. One of the homeless onlookers, an older woman who'd been watching from the fence. Chen let out a whoop that seemed entirely out of character for the reserved engineer. Marcus Webb stood frozen, his entire threat assessment framework apparently requiring recalibration. And Damien Cross, tech billionaire and thermal engineering genius, sat in his $4 million hypercar and felt something he hadn't experienced since the early days of building his company, absolute, overwhelming humility. He climbed out of the car, walked to where Caleb stood, still holding the greasy rag, still wearing his peacoat despite the warming day. Up close, Damien could see the places where intelligence and circumstance had collided, the eyes that missed nothing, the hands that could do impossible things, the body that had been sleeping rough for God knew how long. I need to know something, Damien said. When you first called out through that fence, when we told you to leave, you could have walked away. Nobody would have blamed you, so why didn't you? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, looking at the Quantum Apex, at the technology he'd helped birth, at all the ways his legacy had continued without his name attached. When he spoke, his voice carried 15 years of complicated truths. Because I spent a decade and a half watching people throw away brilliance because it came in the wrong package. Because I've seen more genius die on the streets of this city than most universities produce in a decade. Because every time someone like you dismisses someone like me without a second look, something irreplaceable gets lost. He met Damien's eyes. And because I remember what it felt like to believe that merit mattered more than appearances. I'm not ready to give up on that yet. Even when everything else says I should. The words hung between them, a challenge and an accusation and an invitation all at once. What's your address? Damien asked. I need to send you payment for the repair. Name your price. I don't have an address. Haven't for about 6 years now, and I don't want your money. Then what do you want? Caleb smiled, but there was no humor in it. I want you to remember this moment. Every time you see someone society has decided to throw away, every time someone asks for a chance and you're about to say no, I want you to remember that your flagship vehicle, the thing you built your entire funding pitch around, was saved by a homeless man you tried to have arrested. And then I want you to think about how many other Caleb Mercers are out there, invisible and brilliant and wasted, because nobody has the courage to look past the surface. He turned to leave, actually turned his back on Damien Cross, on money and opportunity and everything most people in his position would have killed for, and started walking toward the gate. Wait, Damien's voice stopped him. You can't just… That's it? You fix my car and walk away. That's what you wanted 5 minutes ago. 5 minutes ago I was an idiot. And now? Now. The question sat there demanding an answer Damien wasn't sure he had. Around them, the film crew was packing up equipment. Marcus was already on the phone, probably running background checks and threat assessments. Chen stood by the Quantum Apex, still staring at the impossible repair like it might disappear if he looked away. Damien thought about the presentation he had to give in 97 minutes. Thought about the investors from Abu Dhabi, their questions about reliability and innovation, and what made Cross Technologies different from every other engineering firm chasing their money. Thought about the speech he'd prepared, full of carefully crafted phrases about disruption and vision and the future of human potential. All of it suddenly felt like ash in his mouth. I gave a TED Talk once, he said, about systematic innovation, about how the real barriers to progress aren't technical, they're social, How we waste human potential by gatekeeping genius behind credentials and connections, and all the arbitrary bullshit that keeps the wrong people out and the right people comfortable. He laughed, but it came out bitter. Standing ovation, 20 million views. I actually believed I meant it. You probably did, Caleb said. Believing and doing are different things. Then help me do it. Don't walk away. Stay. Damien heard the desperation in his own voice and didn't try to hide it. I don't know what that looks like yet. Maybe it's a job. Maybe it's something bigger. But you just saved my company with pocket change and a pencil. Whatever you are, whatever you could be with actual resources, I need that. The world needs that. The world had that. Caleb's voice went hard. The world decided what it needed more was someone to blame when things went wrong. You think you're different? You think 6 years on the streets hasn't taught me exactly how quickly people's principles disappear when it's expensive or inconvenient or socially awkward to maintain them? I think, Damien said carefully, that you wouldn't have stopped at that fence if you'd completely given up on people like me. You would have kept walking. Let me fail. Watched my empire collapse from a comfortable distance, but you didn't. You stopped. You spoke up. You fought to be heard even when everything said you'd be dismissed. He paused. So maybe you're not the only one getting a second chance today. The silence stretched, traffic sounds from the distant highway, the quantum apex's cooling system cycling, Chen's tablet pinging with data alerts, Marcus speaking in low tones on his phone, the entire world continuing its motion while two men stood in a forgotten corner of Detroit's industrial district, negotiating the terms of possibility. I have conditions, Caleb said finally. Name them. First, I need a shower, a meal, and 8 hours of sleep in an actual bed before we discuss anything that sounds like employment. I've been awake for 36 hours, and I'm not making life-changing decisions while my brain is running on fumes and desperation. Damien nodded. Done. Marcus can arrange a hotel. Second, whatever happens next, I want it in writing, contract, lawyer present, no handshake deals, no trusting your word, no assumptions about intentions. I've learned that lesson already. Fair. Third, Caleb's voice went quieter, but somehow more intense. This isn't just about me. There are people at that fence right now, people in shelters across this city, across every city, who have skills and knowledge and potential that's being wasted because they don't fit the profile of what success looks like. If you're serious about second chances, it can't stop with the one guy who happened to have exactly the expertise you needed at exactly the right moment. It has to be systemic, structural, real. I don't know how to do that, Damien admitted. Neither do I. But I know we can't figure it out if I'm walking away and you're driving off to your presentation like this never happened. Caleb looked past Damien toward the quantum apex, toward everything it represented. So here's what I'm proposing. You give me your phone number. I'll call you in 3 days, after I've had time to think and sleep, and remember what it feels like to make decisions that aren't about immediate survival. And we'll talk about what systemic change actually looks like when you're committed to more than just a good story for your next TED Talk. Damien pulled out his phone, pulled up his contact information. But before he could hand it over, Caleb stopped him. One more thing. Before you commit to this, before you hand me that phone number and start down this road, I need you to understand something. His eyes held Damien's with uncomfortable intensity. I'm not your redemption story. I'm not the feel-good narrative you get to tell at conferences about the homeless genius you rescued from the streets. What happened to me wasn't an accident or bad luck or one of those things. It was systematic destruction by people who valued their quarterly profits more than human lives. And there are systems like that everywhere, crushing people every day, and your company probably participates in some of them without even knowing it. So what are you saying? I'm saying that if we do this, if I come work for you, if we build something together, I'm going to be the most inconvenient employee you've ever had. I'm going to ask questions about your supply chain and your hiring practices and where your money comes from and where it goes. I'm going to make you uncomfortable. I'm going to force you to see things you've probably spent your whole career not looking at too closely. Caleb stepped closer. And if you're not ready for that, if what you really want is a brilliant pet project you can trot out for investors, then we should end this conversation right now, because I won't be that. Not for you. Not for anyone. The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Damien could feel Marcus watching, Chen watching, the cameras still rolling even though they'd gotten more than enough footage for any promotional video. His entire team waiting to see how their CEO responded to being called out by a man with nothing to lose. And somewhere in Abu Dhabi, investors were boarding a plane, expecting to see a flawless presentation about innovation and excellence and the future of thermal engineering. Damien thought about the script he'd prepared, the talking points, the carefully cultivated image of visionary leadership. Then he thought about the last 5 minutes, the fear, the helplessness, the moment when all his money and connections meant nothing compared to the knowledge in one man's hands. He thought about every time he'd given a speech about merit and potential and breaking down barriers, and how easy it had been to believe those words when they cost him nothing. "You're right," he said, "about all of it. And I don't know if I'm ready for what you're describing. I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of change you're talking about. But I know that 5 minutes ago you saved my company. And 10 minutes ago I was ready to have you arrested for the crime of being poor and black and knowing more than I did." He extended the phone. "So maybe I'm exactly the kind of person who needs someone making him uncomfortable. Maybe that's the only way anything actually changes." Caleb took the phone, added his number, a prepaid cell, probably about to run out of minutes, handed it back. 3 days, he said. "And Mr. Cross, when I call, I'm going to ask you what you did with this story. Whether you told your investors about the homeless man who saved your car, or whether you sanitized it into something more comfortable. Whether you looked at the other people at that fence and wondered what they could do, or whether you just drove away and forgot they existed." He smiled, and this time there was something almost warm in it. "So choose carefully, because the next conversation we have is going to start with the truth of what you do when nobody's watching." He turned and walked through the gate, back toward the cluster of homeless individuals who'd been watching the entire drama unfold. They greeted him like a returning hero, handshakes and fist bumps and excited chatter. Damien watched as Caleb laughed at something someone said, the sound carrying across the cracked asphalt, and realized he was seeing something he'd probably never witnessed before. A community invisible to most of the world, celebrating a victory most people would never know happened. "Sir?" Marcus appeared at his elbow. "We need to get you cleaned up for the presentation. Traffic to the exhibition center is going to be brutal." "In a minute." "The investors—" "In a minute, Marcus." Damien stood there, watching Caleb disappear into the industrial landscape, a ghost returning to his exile. The quantum apex sat behind him, its systems humming, its impossible repair holding, everything working exactly as it was supposed to work. And for the first time in 15 years of building Cross Technologies, Damien Cross wondered if he'd been measuring success by the wrong metrics entirely. Chen approached with the diagnostic tablet, his expression somewhere between excitement and confusion. "Sir, I've been looking at the repair. I don't know how to describe it. It's like he invented a new material science application on the spot. This nanobond compound, if we could replicate it, patent it." "No patents." Damien's voice was firm. "Not without his explicit consent. Not without his name on every document. That's his work, not ours." "But, sir, he just made it from our materials. Technically, he just saved us from a disaster our own engineering team couldn't solve. Technically, he did it with pocket change and a pencil while we stood around with millions of dollars of diagnostic equipment being useless. Technically, I was about to have security remove him for the crime of being right." Damien looked at his engineer. "So no patents, no claiming credit. Not unless he decides that's what he wants. Are we clear?" Chen nodded slowly. "Clear, sir. But are you really going to hire him? A homeless man with no verifiable employment history, no references, probably no permanent address?" "I don't know yet. That's his decision, not mine. What I'm going to do is tell the investors exactly what happened here. All of it. The failure, the fear, the man at the fence, the impossible repair. The whole truth. That's a significant risk. They might see it as a reliability concern. Or they might see it as exactly what I've been promising them. Innovation that breaks every convention about where brilliance comes from. They might see a company that's humble enough to accept help from unexpected places and smart enough to recognize genius even when it shows up in duct-taped boots." Damien checked his watch. 73 minutes to the presentation. Or they might pull their funding and I'll lose everything. But you know what? Caleb Mercer lost everything 15 years ago for telling an inconvenient truth. So maybe it's my turn to find out what that feels like. He turned back toward the quantum apex, toward the presentation that would either make or break his company's future. Behind him, the industrial district stretched away toward the city proper, full of forgotten places and forgotten people, and all the genius society had decided it didn't need. But somewhere in those forgotten streets, a homeless man with duct-taped boots carried knowledge that had just saved a $4 million hypercar. And in 3 days, his phone would ring. And everything that came after would depend on what Damien Cross did with the truth between now and then. The engine hummed, the cameras packed up, the crowd dispersed. And the real story, the one that mattered, was just beginning. The exhibition center's green room felt like a different planet from the industrial wasteland Damien had left 40 minutes ago. Recessed lighting, leather furniture, an espresso machine that probably cost more than Caleb's entire worldly possessions. Marcus had orchestrated the transformation with military efficiency, fresh shirt, emergency grooming, talking points refined and polished. Everything designed to project the image of a man in complete control. Damien caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. Not because of the clothes or the styling, but because something fundamental had shifted behind his eyes. He looked like someone who'd just watched their certainties crack open and couldn't figure out how to seal them back up. 5 minutes, Mr. Cross. The event coordinator, an efficient woman named Alicia, appeared in the doorway. The consortium members are in their seats. Media is positioned. We're ready when you are. Thank you. Damien adjusted his tie, the silk suddenly feeling like a noose. Alicia, quick question. In your professional opinion, how do you think an investor group from Abu Dhabi would respond to a story about failure and vulnerability? She blinked, clearly not expecting philosophical queries 5 minutes before a $300 million pitch. That would depend entirely on the context and delivery, sir. Generally, we emphasize strength and reliability in these presentations. Why do you ask? Because I'm about to throw out my entire prepared speech and tell them the truth instead. The color drained from her face. Mr. Cross, with respect, that's not... We've choreographed every element of this presentation. The lighting cues, the video segments, the product demonstration. If you deviate from the script, then we'll improvise. Damien smiled, and it felt like the first genuine expression his face had made in hours. Don't worry, either it'll be brilliant or it'll be a disaster. Either way, it'll definitely be memorable. He walked past her before she could mount further objections, following the corridor toward the main stage. Through the walls, he could hear the ambient sound of a waiting audience. Coughs, shuffled papers, the low murmur of conversation in Arabic and English. 300 people who'd gathered to watch Damien Cross unveil the future of thermal engineering. None of them knew they were about to hear a very different story. The stage manager handed him a wireless microphone. The house lights dimmed, a spotlight warmed up, waiting to catch him the moment he stepped into view. Behind the curtain, the quantum apex sat on its rotating display platform, its obsidian paint gleaming under carefully positioned floods. The star of the show, the technological marvel that had almost died in a warehouse parking lot. Damien closed his eyes. Heard Caleb's voice in his memory. I'm going to ask you what you did with this story. Whether you told your investors about the homeless man who saved your car, or whether you sanitized it into something more comfortable. He stepped onto the stage. The applause was polite, professional. Damien scanned the front rows, picking out the consortium members. Sheikh Rahman al-Mazrui and his technical advisors, all dressed in immaculate thobes and gutras, expressions neutral and evaluating. To their left, the American venture capitalists in their Silicon Valley casual. Behind them, journalists from tech publications, cameras already recording, waiting for the sound bites they'd package into headlines. Thank you all for coming, Damien began, and even to his own ears his voice sounded different, less polished, more human. I had a speech prepared, 43 minutes of carefully crafted talking points about innovation and disruption and why Cross Technologies represents the future of thermal engineering. My PR team spent 6 weeks on it. It was really good. A ripple of uncertain laughter. Sheikh Rahman's expression didn't change, but one of his advisors leaned forward slightly. I'm not going to give that speech. Damien set down his prepared notes on the podium, a physical gesture of abandonment. Instead, I'm going to tell you what happened 3 hours ago. And then you can decide whether Cross Technologies is the kind of company you want to invest in or the kind you want to run from as fast as humanly possible. Now he had their attention. The journalists' cameras zoomed in. The consortium members exchanged glances. In the wings, he could see Alicia making frantic gestures, probably signaling for someone to cut the feed or lower the curtain or somehow contain the disaster unfolding in real time. This morning, Damien continued, gesturing toward the Quantum Apex, our flagship vehicle, the one you came here to see demonstrate its capabilities, suffered a catastrophic cooling system failure, a microfracture in the secondary loop housing. We had maybe 15 minutes before the entire motor assembly would have seized, turning $4 million of engineering into an expensive paperweight. Dead silence. He could practically hear investors mentally calculating the implications. My chief engineer couldn't fix it. Our diagnostic systems identified the problem but offered no solutions. I was about to call the manufacturer, who was 8 hours away, and I was preparing to cancel this presentation, to apologize for wasting your time, to watch $300 million in funding evaporate because we couldn't deliver on our promises. He paused. And then a homeless man offered to help. Someone in the third row actually gasped. Sheikh Rahman's eyebrows rose fractionally, the first crack in his carefully maintained neutrality. A black man in his late 40s, wearing a pea coat held together with duct tape, standing on the other side of a chain-link fence in one of Detroit's forgotten industrial districts. He shouted technical specifications at us, told us exactly what was failing and exactly how much time we had left. My security team wanted to remove him. I wanted to call the police. Because everything about the situation screamed threat to people who've been trained to see the world through a very particular lens. Damien stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the audience, making this intimate rather than formal. But he wasn't a threat. His name is Caleb Mercer, and 15 years ago he was the lead thermal engineer for the Helios 7 cooling system, the foundation technology that our entire quantum platform is built on. He designed the architecture we've been taking credit for. He identified the specific failure mode we encountered this morning because he'd predicted it over a decade ago and tried to warn people about it. What happened to him? The question came from one of the venture capitalists, a woman named Sarah Chen, whom Damien had worked with on previous deals. He reported a safety concern on a military contract. The concern was valid. The system failed during testing, nearly killed 6 people, but the company needed a scapegoat, so they blamed him for the design flaw, stripped his name from the patents, and systematically destroyed his career. Industry blacklist. Professional exile. By the time the truth came out, it was too late. No one would touch him. And 15 years later, he's sleeping on the streets of the city where his genius helped build 6 fortunes for other people. The silence now felt different, heavier. Several audience members had stopped taking notes. They were just listening. So I had a choice, Damien said. I could maintain my pride, protect my intellectual property, follow every security protocol that says you don't let random strangers near multi-million-dollar prototypes. Or I could take a massive risk on someone society had already declared worthless. You know which choice I made, because that car behind me is running. Caleb fixed it in under 5 minutes, using emergency sealant and graphite from a drafting pencil. Created a nanobond compound that solved a problem our entire engineering team couldn't crack. Saved this presentation. Saved my company. Saved my reputation. He turned to face the Quantum Apex directly. And then, when I tried to pay him, when I offered him money or a job or whatever I thought might balance the scales, he said no. He said what he wanted was for me to remember this moment, to remember that the thing I'd built my entire pitch around was saved by someone I'd been ready to have arrested, and to think about how many other brilliant minds are out there being wasted because they don't look like what we've decided genius is supposed to look like. Damien faced the audience again. So here's what I'm offering you today. Not just a revolutionary thermal system, though we have that. Not just a vehicle that redefines performance parameters, though that's sitting behind me. What I'm offering is a company that's willing to admit when it's wrong, that's capable of seeing value in unexpected places, that understands innovation doesn't just come from people with the right credentials and the right connections and the right appearance. Sheikh Rahman stood. For one heart-stopping moment, Damien thought he was walking out. Instead, the sheikh approached the stage, his technical advisors following. Up close, Rahman was younger than Damien had expected, maybe 50, with silver threading through his beard and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "This man who helped you," Rahman said, his English accented but precise. "Caleb Mercer. Where is he now?" "Back on the streets. I gave him my phone number. He's supposed to call in 3 days." "Supposed to?" "He doesn't trust me. Can't say I blame him. People with power have spent 15 years proving he was right not to trust them." Rahman nodded slowly. "In my country, we have a concept, karama, human dignity. The idea that every person possesses inherent worth regardless of circumstances or status. It's not just philosophy. It's supposed to guide how we conduct business, how we treat people, how we build things." He gestured toward the quantum apex. "Your vehicle is impressive. Your technology is strong. But this story you've told, this admission of failure and humility, this is more valuable than any specification sheet." One of his advisors stepped forward, a younger man with sharp eyes and an MIT ring on his finger. "I have questions about the repair methodology. This nanobond compound using graphite and emergency sealant, that's not a documented procedure. How do we verify its reliability?" "We can't," Damien admitted. "Not completely. Caleb estimated it would hold for 500 to 800 thermal cycles. After that, we need to replace the housing. But that's not the point. The point is that when our established methods failed, innovation came from someone working with almost nothing. And if we can harness that kind of creative problem solving, if we can build systems that elevate that kind of thinking instead of crushing it, then we're not just building better vehicles, we're building a better approach to how innovation actually happens." "Pretty words," a voice called from the venture capital section. Daniel Rostov, an investor known for aggressive due diligence and zero tolerance for anything that smelled like PR spin. "But how does this translate into actual business practice? You're asking us to invest $300 million. What guarantee do we have that this isn't just a one-time feel-good story you'll forget about the moment the contracts are signed?" "None." Damien met his gaze directly. "You have no guarantee, but here's what I can offer. Transparency. If you invest in Cross Technologies, I'll share every detail of what happened this morning. The failure, the fix, the man who saved us. It'll be in our quarterly reports, our investor updates, our public communications. And if I'm serious about systemic change, about building something that actually elevates overlooked talent, then you'll be able to hold me accountable every step of the way. And if this Caleb doesn't call, if he decides he wants nothing to do with your company, then I'll find other Calebs. Because this morning taught me something I should have known already. Brilliance is everywhere. It's in boardrooms and it's on street corners. It's in people with PhDs and people who never finished high school. The only difference is who we've decided to see and who we've decided to ignore." Damien's voice gained strength. "So whether Caleb comes back or not, Cross Technologies is going to start looking in places we haven't been looking. Hiring from populations we haven't been hiring from. Taking risks on people other companies have written off. And if that makes us a bad investment in your eyes, I respect that. But I can't keep building an empire on the backs of stolen genius and pretending that's innovation." The room erupted. Questions from journalists, urgent consultations between consortium members, investors pulling out phones to text their analysts. Alicia appeared at the edge of the stage, her expression somewhere between panic and awe. Marcus stood in the wings, hand on his radio, looking like a man watching his carefully constructed security protocols dissolve in real time. And Damien stood at the center of it all, having just committed corporate suicide or redefined everything his company stood for, and genuinely wasn't sure which one it was. Sheikh Rahman raised his hand. The noise died down. "Mr. Cross, my advisors and I need to discuss what we've heard today. This is not the presentation we expected, but that doesn't make it unwelcome." He glanced at his team, received subtle nods. "We will retire to conference room. We will review technical specifications, and we will consider whether your philosophy matches our own investment principles. Please give us 1 hour." "Of course." The consortium filed out, their faces unreadable. The journalists swarmed forward, questions overlapping into incomprehensibility. Security moved in to create a barrier, and Damien let himself be herded back toward the green room while the carefully orchestrated event collapsed into beautiful chaos. Chen caught him in the corridor. "Sir, that was either the bravest or most insane thing I've ever witnessed in 15 years of corporate presentations." "Probably both." Damien loosened his tie, suddenly exhausted. "What's your honest assessment? Did I just destroy everything we've built?" "I don't know. But I know I've never been more proud to work for this company." Chen pulled up his tablet, already showing social media feeds. Twitter is exploding. Someone live-streamed the whole thing. Hashtag Caleb Mercer is trending. People are already trying to find him, verify the story, dig into the Helios 7 scandal. Jesus. Damien hadn't considered that angle. We need to protect his privacy. The last thing he needs is internet detectives harassing him. Bit late for that. But most of the response seems positive. People calling you out for being honest about the failure. Engineers talking about the industry's bias problems. Someone even started a GoFundMe to help the genius who saved the hypercar. Tell them to stop. Caleb made it clear he doesn't want charity. He wants... Damien paused, realizing he wasn't entirely sure what Caleb wanted. A system that worked differently. Recognition without exploitation. Justice without condescension. All things that sounded simple until you tried to actually implement them. Marcus appeared, his expression grim. "Sir, we have a situation. There's a reporter from TechCrunch who's already sent someone to the industrial district where we were filming this morning. They're interviewing the homeless population, looking for Caleb Mercer. Stop them." "On what grounds?" "They're journalists. We don't control public spaces." "Then get someone there who actually gives a damn about those people and make sure they're not being exploited for clicks." Damien's voice went hard. "And Marcus, from now on when I say we need to protect someone, I need you to treat that as serious as physical security. Reputation assassination is still violence. Understood?" Marcus blinked. "Understood, sir." The hour crawled by. Damien tried to focus on the technical documentation his team had prepared, but the words swam meaninglessly across the page. He kept thinking about Caleb walking back through that chain-link gate, returning to whatever passed for home in the forgotten places of the city. Kept wondering if he'd watch the news, see his story going viral, and feel violated all over again. Finally, Alicia appeared in the doorway. "They're ready, Mr. Cross." The consortium had reconvened in a smaller conference room, the atmosphere dramatically different from the formal presentation hall. Sheikh Rahman sat at the head of the table, his advisors flanking him, their body language more relaxed than before. That could mean anything. "Please sit." Rahman gestured to the chair across from him. Once Damien settled, the sheikh opened a leather portfolio and extracted several documents. "We've reviewed the technical specifications, the performance data, the market analysis, all very impressive. But honestly, Mr. Cross, we've seen impressive specifications before. The automotive and aerospace sectors are full of brilliant engineers making brilliant vehicles." Damien's stomach dropped. Here it came. The polite rejection. "What we haven't seen," Rahman continued, "is a CEO willing to stand in front of investors and admit failure, to share credit with someone who has no legal claim to it, to risk his entire company on a principle that most corporations treat as optional." He slid a document across the table. "So we're prepared to offer you $400 million in funding, not $300, with one condition." Damien stared at the number. "What condition?" The MIT-educated advisor spoke up. "We want oversight on how you implement this commitment to finding overlooked talent, not control. We're not interested in micromanaging your hiring practices, but we want quarterly reports on initiatives, programs, outcomes. We want to see this isn't just a publicity stunt that disappears the moment the press attention fades. You want to hold me accountable. We want to invest in a company that's actually trying to change how innovation happens. That's worth more than thermal engineering specifications." The advisor smiled. "Also, if you do manage to bring Caleb Mercer onto your team, we'd like to fund a research division focused specifically on his work. No restrictions, no corporate oversight, pure research budget. He's earned that much." Damien felt something unknot in his chest that he hadn't realized was choking him. "You're serious?" "Completely." Rahman extended his hand. There are enough companies chasing quarterly profits and shareholder returns. We want to invest in something that might actually matter in 20 years, something our grandchildren won't be ashamed of. They shook. The advisor produced contracts that their legal teams would need to review, but the fundamental commitment was there. $400 million, betting not just on technology, but on the possibility that business could be done differently. Damien walked out of that conference room in a daze. Chen practically tackled him in the hallway, having clearly been watching through the windows. "Sir, they're signing? They're actually signing? They're signing, and they're giving us $100 million more than we asked for." "Oh my God. Oh my God. This is—" Chen stopped, his expression shifting. "Sir, there's something you need to see. It's about Caleb." They found a quiet corner with Chen's tablet. The screen showed a TechCrunch article already published, time-stamped 20 minutes ago. The headline read, "The genius behind cross-technology's miracle, Fix speaks out." The article featured an interview with Caleb clearly conducted in the last hour. Someone had found him fast. The photo showed him standing near the industrial fence, still in his pea coat, looking directly at the camera with those unflinching eyes. Damien read quickly, his heart rate accelerating with each paragraph. The reporter had asked Caleb about Damien's presentation, about going public with the story, about the sudden internet attention, and the GoFundMe, and all the ways his life had just been thrown into public view without his consent. Caleb's response was measured but firm. Mr. Cross told the truth, which is more than most people in his position would do. But telling the truth isn't the same as changing the system. If this becomes just another feel-good story about a successful white CEO saving a poor black man, then nothing's actually changed. We've just found a more palatable way to maintain the same hierarchies. The reporter had pressed, "So you're not grateful?" "Grateful that my work finally got acknowledged after 15 years? Sure. Grateful that it took a public crisis to make that happen? Not so much. Grateful that people are now treating my survival as entertainment? Absolutely not. What I want is for this to be the beginning of actual systemic change, not the end of a viral news cycle. We'll see which one Damien Cross delivers." The article concluded with Caleb's statement that he hadn't decided yet whether he'd call Damien in 3 days, that he was watching to see what happened next, whether the attention led to action or just to more comfortable narratives that let powerful people feel good about themselves. "He's testing you," Chen said quietly. "Everything you do in the next 72 hours. He's watching." "Everyone's watching." Damien gestured at the tablet, where the article already had thousands of shares. This isn't just about convincing Caleb anymore. It's about proving that today wasn't theater. So what do we do? Damien thought about the $400 million that had just been committed to his company. Thought about the quarterly reports the consortium wanted on talent development. Thought about Caleb's sketches drawn on scraps over 3 lost years, ideas worth more than the hypercar. "We start building something real," he said finally. "Not a PR campaign, not a diversity initiative that looks good on paper but changes nothing. Something that actually addresses why people like Caleb end up on the streets in the first place." That's a massive undertaking. We'd need infrastructure, partnerships, legal framework. Then we start building it. Tonight. Right now. Damien pulled out his phone, started scrolling through contacts. "I want a meeting with our legal team, our HR director, and anyone in the company who has experience with nonprofit work or social enterprise. I want proposals for how we structure something that can't be quietly disbanded when it's no longer convenient. And I want to understand what happened 15 years ago. The real story, not the sanitized version. Who destroyed Caleb's career, and are they still in positions where they can do it to other people?" Chen was taking notes rapidly. "This is going to be expensive and complicated and probably controversial." "Good. If it's easy and comfortable, we're not doing it right." Damien looked at the article again, at Caleb's face staring out from the screen with that expression of cautious skepticism. He said 3 days. Let's show him what we can build in 72 hours. The next 3 days blurred into a frenzy of activity that felt less like corporate planning and more like controlled chaos. Damien canceled every other commitment, turned his office into a war room, and assembled a team that looked nothing like the usual executive committee. Legal brought in specialists on labor law and employment discrimination. HR connected him with organizations that worked on second chance hiring and re-entry programs. Chen dug into the technical archives, reconstructing exactly what had happened with the Helios 7 project and who'd been involved in Caleb's professional destruction. The answers that emerged were both expected and infuriating. The company that had buried Caleb was Defense Tech Industries, now merged into a larger aerospace conglomerate. The executives who'd orchestrated his downfall had moved on to other positions, their careers untouched by the lives they'd destroyed. The investigation into the safety failure had quietly concluded that Caleb had been right all along, but by then the narrative was set and no one had bothered to correct the public record. Standard playbook, the labor attorney said when Damien showed her the documentation. Blame the individual, protect the institution. Happens every day in 1,000 different ways, usually to people who don't have the resources to fight back. So how do we fight back now? You can't undo what happened to Caleb, but you can make sure it doesn't happen to the next person. That's what systemic change actually means, removing the mechanisms that enable this kind of destruction in the first place. They worked through scenarios, built frameworks, stress-tested ideas. By the end of the second day, they had something that resembled a plan, a new division within Cross Technologies dedicated specifically to talent recovery and development. Not a charitable program, but an actual business unit with budget authority and strategic importance. They'd partner with organizations already doing this work, leverage Cross's resources and connections, and create pathways for people with non-traditional backgrounds to access opportunities in engineering and technology. The working name was the Talent Recovery Innovation Center, Caleb's phrase, now formalized into structure. On the third morning, Damien sat in his office with the preliminary proposal, 63 pages of legal documents, organizational charts, budget projections, and implementation timelines. It was real, imperfect, certainly, probably naive in ways he hadn't anticipated, but real. His phone rang at 2:47 p.m. Unknown number, prepaid cell. Damien answered on the second ring. Caleb? You waited. There was something almost surprised in Caleb's voice. I half expected you to call me first, try to control the narrative. I wanted to have something to show you, not promises, actual work. A long pause. I saw the article, the one where I basically called you out publicly. You were right to. I needed to hear it. And you're not angry? I'm angry about a lot of things right now, but not at you. Damien swiveled his chair to look out at the city skyline. I'm angry that I needed a crisis to see what should have been obvious. I'm angry that the system that destroyed you is still destroying other people. I'm angry that fixing it is going to be harder than I thought, and take longer than I want, and still probably won't be enough. Caleb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its defensive edge. What have you been doing for 3 days? Building the thing you asked for, the Talent Recovery Innovation Center. Actual budget, actual authority, actual commitment. It's not perfect, it's probably full of blind spots and mistakes, but it's real. And I'd like you to help make it better. Send me the documentation. What's your email? Caleb laughed, but without bitterness. I don't have an email, Damien. I'm calling from a library computer. How about you tell me where to meet you instead? They agreed on a coffee shop in Midtown, neutral territory that wasn't Damien's office or Caleb's streets. Damien arrived first, claimed a quiet table in the back, and tried not to think about all the ways this conversation could go wrong. Caleb appeared exactly on time. He'd showered, probably at a shelter, and his clothes were cleaner, but he was still wearing the peacoat and the duct-taped boots, still looking like exactly what he was, a man who'd been surviving rather than living for far too long. He sat down across from Damien. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Caleb said, "You changed the world in 3 days. Or you're about to tell me you tried and it was harder than expected and maybe we should start with something smaller." I built a framework. Whether it changes anything depends on what we do with it. Damien slid the proposal across the table. This is what 72 Hours bought. A division dedicated to finding people like you, people the industry has overlooked or discarded. Partnerships with re-entry programs, community organizations, trade schools. Budget for R&D that's actually accessible to people without traditional credentials. Legal structure that makes it hard to disband when it's inconvenient. Caleb paged through the document, his expression unreadable. Damien waited, forcing himself not to fill the silence with justifications or explanations. Finally, Caleb looked up. This is more than I expected, but it's still a corporate structure, still operates within systems that are fundamentally designed to exclude people like me. What happens when your quarterly profits drop and investors start asking why you're spending money on people who might not generate immediate returns? Then I show them the contract they signed. The consortium that invested in us specifically wanted oversight on this. They built accountability into the funding agreement. Damien leaned forward. But you're right. Corporate structures are limited, so I'm also setting up a separate nonprofit. Same mission, different funding sources. If Cross Technologies fails or gets acquired or decides to abandon its principles, the nonprofit continues independently. It's not perfect protection, but it's something. You've been busy. I had motivation. You said you'd judge me by what I did when nobody was watching. Turns out everyone's watching now, but the principle still applies. Damien paused. Caleb, I can't fix what happened to you 15 years ago. I can't give you back the career you lost or the recognition you deserved, but I can try to make sure the next person doesn't lose quite as much. That's what I'm offering, not redemption. I don't get to claim that, just partnership. In building something that might actually work differently. Caleb closed the proposal. I have conditions. I expected you would. First, I'm not your poster child. You don't get to use my story in marketing materials or investor pitches without my explicit consent. This isn't about making Cross Technologies look progressive. It's about actually changing how we find and elevate talent. Agreed. Second, I want equity, not just a salary. If I'm helping build this, I want ownership stake in both the company and the nonprofit. Enough that I have actual voting power, not just advisory input. Our lawyers can structure that. Third, I want to bring other people with me, not just me getting saved while everyone else I know stays on the streets. There are mechanics and engineers and designers and brilliant minds scattered across this city's homeless population. I want pathways for them too. Real ones, not just feel-good programs that screen out anyone who doesn't fit a narrow profile. That's the whole point of what we're building. And fourth, Caleb's voice went quiet. I want the truth about what happened 15 years ago made public. Full disclosure, names, documentation, everything. The people who destroyed my career are still out there, still in positions of power. If we're serious about systemic change, we have to be serious about accountability, not just moving forward, but actually addressing past harm. Damien felt the weight of that request. Going after defense tech industries and its successors meant making powerful enemies. It meant legal battles and professional consequences and all the ways the industry protected its own. It also meant doing exactly what Caleb had done 15 years ago, telling an inconvenient truth regardless of the cost. Okay, Damien said. We'll do it. All of it. But Caleb, that's going to get ugly. These people have resources and lawyers and every incentive to bury this. Are you prepared for that fight? I've been living with the consequences of that fight for 15 years. At least now I'll have resources to fight back. Caleb extended his hand across the table. So, do we have a partnership, Mr. Cross? A real one, with all the messiness and risk that implies? Damien took his hand. The calluses told stories of survival. The grip was firm and steady and absolutely uncompromising. We have a partnership. And Caleb? It's Damien. We're equals in this or it doesn't work at all. For the first time since they'd met, Caleb smiled. Not with irony or bitterness, but with something that might actually be hope. Then let's get to work, Damien. We've got a lot of systems to break. They moved fast after that handshake, faster than any corporate initiative Damien had ever launched. Within a week, Caleb had an office at Cross Technologies. Not a symbolic gesture tucked away in some forgotten corner, but a proper workspace on the executive floor with windows overlooking the city and a door that locked. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Neither was the discomfort it created. Damien watched his senior staff struggle with Caleb's presence in ways they thought they were hiding. The too careful politeness, the unconscious step back when he entered an elevator, the way conversations would pause when he appeared, then resume with forced normalcy. Marcus had run the background check quietly, found nothing criminal but plenty of gaps where a life should have been, and now approached Caleb like he was simultaneously a security risk and a lawsuit waiting to happen. Give them time, Caleb said one morning, catching Damien's expression as they passed another cluster of employees who suddenly found their phones fascinating. I make people uncomfortable. That's what happens when you're living proof that the system they've benefited from is fundamentally broken. Nobody wants to think too hard about why I was on the streets while they were climbing corporate ladders. That's not an excuse for treating you like you don't belong here. I don't belong here, not in the way they understand belonging. That's the point. Caleb adjusted his new clothes, button-down shirt, slacks, shoes without duct tape, and Damien could see how the professional costume sat awkwardly on him. You can't just drop someone from the streets into a corner office and expect everyone to pretend 15 years of trauma and survival didn't happen. The discomfort is the work. If they're not uncomfortable, we're not changing anything real. They were heading to the conference room where Damien had assembled the team that would build the Talent Recovery Innovation Center. Legal, HR, Chen from engineering, plus 3 external consultants who'd spent careers working on workforce development and second-chance hiring. The air in the room felt charged with something between excitement and dread. Before we start, Damien said once everyone had settled, I want to establish something fundamental. Caleb isn't here as a charity case or a diversity initiative or a feel-good story we get to tell investors. He's here as a partner with full authority over this project. What he says carries the same weight as what I say. If you can't operate with that understanding, you need to leave now. Nobody moved, but the tension ratcheted higher. Damien had just upended every hierarchy they'd internalized about how organizations functioned. Caleb stood, moving to the whiteboard mounted on the wall. His body language shifted when he had a problem to solve. The uncertainty disappeared, replaced by the confident precision of an engineer approaching a design challenge. Let's start with why traditional hiring fails. Not the polite reasons we tell ourselves, but the real structural barriers. He began writing, his handwriting surprisingly elegant. Credential requirements that have nothing to do with actual job competency. Background checks that criminalize poverty. Reference requirements that assume stable employment history. Interview processes that reward polished performance over genuine expertise. Probationary periods that don't account for the chaos of rebuilding a life. Salary structures that don't cover the upfront costs of professional clothing, transportation, childcare. The list grew. Each item was specific, drawn from lived experience rather than abstract theory. Damien watched the consultants nodding, recognition dawning on their faces. This wasn't academic research. This was testimony. Every single one of these barriers, Caleb continued, exists for a reason that made sense to someone. But cumulatively, they create a system that only works for people who've never experienced serious disruption. One major life crisis, medical emergency, family tragedy, wrongful termination, and you're locked out. The longer you're locked out, the harder it becomes to get back in. Eventually, your resume becomes evidence of your unworthiness rather than a temporary reflection of circumstances. So how do we fix it? The question came from Yolanda Martinez, head of HR, a woman who'd been with Cross Technologies since its early days. Her tone was genuine curiosity, not challenge. We don't fix it. We build something parallel that operates on different principles. Caleb turned back to the group. We create pathways that evaluate people based on what they can actually do, not what their paperwork says they've done. We structure support systems that acknowledge the reality of rebuilding a life. We measure success differently, not just productivity metrics, but stability metrics, growth metrics, dignity metrics. That sounds expensive, one of the consultants said carefully, and difficult to scale. It is both those things. It's also cheaper than the current system's failure costs, if you're willing to count human potential as an asset instead of an externality. Caleb's voice carried an edge now. Every person sleeping on the streets of this city represents skills and knowledge and innovation that we've decided isn't worth the inconvenience of accessing. The question isn't whether we can afford to change the system. The question is whether we can afford to keep wasting talent at this scale. Damien added, the consortium that invested in us explicitly funded this. $400 million with built-in accountability measures. This isn't altruism. It's strategic investment in overlooked human capital. We have the resources. What we need now is the structure. They spent the next 6 hours building that structure, not in abstract terms, but in concrete specifics. How many positions would they create in the first year? What skills would they prioritize? How would they partner with existing organizations serving homeless populations? What support systems would they provide beyond just employment? Housing assistance, mental health services, legal aid for clearing criminal records, professional development without the usual gatekeeping. Chen raised the question everyone was probably thinking. What about the engineering positions? We can't just hand someone a wrench and say, build a hypercar. There are safety requirements, liability issues, quality control standards. You're right, Caleb said, which is why we start with apprenticeship models. Pair people with existing engineers. Let them prove competency through work rather than credentials. Create evaluation frameworks based on demonstrated skill rather than degrees or certifications. He paused. And we acknowledge that some of these people might know more than their supposed mentors. That happened with me and your hypercar. It'll happen again if we're serious about finding buried expertise. That's going to create conflicts, Yolanda said. Ego issues. Resentment from people who spent years getting credentials only to work alongside someone who didn't. Good. Let them be resentful. Let them examine why they're more invested in maintaining hierarchies than in actually solving problems. Caleb's expression was unyielding. This whole project fails if we prioritize comfort over change. We're going to make people uncomfortable. That's not a bug. It's the entire point. The meeting stretched into evening. Pizza was ordered, coffee was consumed in quantities that would probably violate some health guideline. And slowly, painstakingly, something real began to emerge. Not a diversity program or a charitable initiative, but an actual restructuring of how cross-technologies would identify, develop, and retain talent. By midnight, they had a framework. 15 positions in the first quarter, growing to 50 by year's end. Partnership agreements with 3 homeless services organizations. A dedicated support team including social workers, case managers, and legal advocates. Modified background check policies that focused on safety-critical issues rather than blanket disqualification. Salary structures that included upfront stipends for professional clothing and transportation. Housing subsidies for the first 6 months. Mental health services without the stigma of formal EAP programs. This is ambitious, one of the consultants said, reviewing the projected budget. Maybe too ambitious. If even a quarter of these placements fail, then we learn from the failures and adjust, Damien interrupted. But we don't scale back before we've even started because we're afraid of what failure looks like. Caleb, what's your assessment? Caleb studied the whiteboard, now covered in diagrams and timelines and implementation strategies. It's a start. Not perfect, but genuine. The real test will be what happens when the first hire doesn't work out, or when someone relapses into addiction, or when we have to make hard choices between metrics and humanity. That's when we'll find out if this is real or just expensive theater. So what do we do to make sure it stays real? We build in accountability that's actually meaningful, not just quarterly reports to investors, but regular consultation with the people we're supposedly serving. We create advisory boards that include formerly homeless individuals, not just service providers who think they know what's needed. We commit to transparency about what works and what doesn't. And we accept that sometimes the most effective approaches are going to look nothing like traditional corporate best practices. Damien looked around the room at his assembled team, exhausted, uncertain, but committed. Okay, let's do this. Yolanda, I want job descriptions drafted by Friday. Chen, work with Caleb to identify which engineering projects can accommodate apprenticeship models. Legal team, get the partnership agreements in motion. Everyone reports progress in 72 hours. They filed out slowly, the weight of what they'd just committed to settling over them like snow. Caleb remained, still studying the whiteboard as if looking for flaws in the architecture. You're worried, Damien observed. I'm terrified. Not of failure. I'm familiar with that. I'm terrified of partial success, of this becoming the kind of initiative that looks good on paper but doesn't actually transform anything. Caleb turned to face him. I've seen a lot of well-intentioned programs, Damien. Most of them fail not because of bad design, but because they're not willing to go deep enough. They want to help individuals without confronting the systems that created the problem in the first place. So how do we go deeper? We keep the promise I made you accept. We expose what happened 15 years ago. Not just my story, but the entire mechanism that allowed it to happen. We name names, we show receipts, we make it impossible for those people to keep operating with impunity. His jaw tightened. That's the part that's going to hurt. Not building something new, but actually holding the old system accountable. The investigation into Caleb's professional destruction began the next morning. Damien hired a forensic firm that specialized in corporate malfeasance, the kind of investigators who'd worked on major fraud cases and whistleblower protections. He gave them full access to Cross Technology's legal resources and a simple directive: find the truth and document everything. What they found was worse than expected and depressingly familiar. Defense Tech Industries had known about the design flaw in the Helios 7 system for 8 months before the test flight failure. Internal emails showed engineers, including Caleb, raising concerns that were systematically dismissed by project management under pressure to meet contract deadlines. When the system failed during testing, nearly killing 6 people, as Caleb had said, the company needed to demonstrate swift accountability to the military customer. Caleb had been the obvious scapegoat, the only senior black engineer on the project, someone whose removal would satisfy demands for consequences without actually implicating management or threatening future contracts. The company's legal team had orchestrated his termination with surgical precision, crafting a narrative of negligence and incompetence that was technically defamatory but expensive to challenge. They paid a settlement to the victims' families, the lead investigator explained, spreading documents across Damien's desk. $3.2 million. Included non-disclosure agreements preventing the victims from discussing the cause of the failure. Caleb was specifically named in internal communications as the acceptable loss needed to preserve the company's reputation. His name was removed from patents retroactively using a legal mechanism designed for cases of fraud, which this wasn't, but the paperwork was filed in a jurisdiction where he'd have needed significant resources to challenge it. Who ordered it? Damien asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lawrence Hendricks, then VP of Engineering, now CEO of Aerodynamics Corporation. Victoria Chen, then General Counsel, now partner at Sterling and Whitmore, and about 6 other executives who've moved on to various positions in the aerospace and defense sectors. The investigator pulled up a network diagram showing where these individuals had ended up. They're all still working, all successful. None faced any professional consequences. Damien stared at the names, feeling rage build in his chest. We're going to destroy them. With respect, Mr. Cross, that's going to be complicated. The statute of limitations on most of the relevant claims has expired. The defamation would be hard to prove given the passage of time, and these are people with significant legal resources and reputational interest to protect. I don't care about criminal charges. I care about the truth being public record. Can we do that? Yes, but it'll be expensive, and they'll fight back hard. Expect countersuits, reputation attacks, pressure on your investors to distance themselves. This won't be clean. Good, Caleb said from the doorway, where he'd been listening silently. Clean doesn't change anything. Clean is how they've gotten away with it for 15 years. Over the next 3 weeks, they built the case methodically. The investigative firm gathered internal documents through discovery requests and Freedom of Information Act filings related to the military contract. They interviewed former Defense Tech employees who'd witnessed the scapegoating but had been too afraid to speak up at the time. They traced the pattern of Caleb's professional isolation, the blacklist that wasn't documented anywhere but was absolutely real in its effects. And they found others. Caleb hadn't been Defense Tech's only sacrifice. Over 20 years, the company had systematically destroyed the careers of at least 7 other engineers who'd raised safety concerns or refused to falsify data or otherwise threatened quarterly performance metrics. Most were people of color or women. All had been professionally exiled using similar playbooks. None had the resources to fight back effectively. We need to contact them, Caleb said when he saw the list. They deserve to be part of this. Their stories matter too. Finding them was harder than expected. One had died. Suicide, his family believed, though it was never confirmed. 2 had moved abroad to rebuild their lives. 3 were still in the United States, working jobs far below their expertise levels, their brilliant careers reduced to survival employment. One was homeless in Portland. Damien authorized travel and outreach. His team approached each person carefully, explaining what they were building and offering not just vindication but participation in holding defense tech accountable. The responses varied. Some wanted nothing to do with revisiting their trauma, while others seized the opportunity like drowning people grabbing a lifeline. Maria Santos, a structural engineer who'd been pushed out 6 years ago for reporting falsified stress test data, flew in from California. When she walked into Cross Technologies and saw Caleb, they embraced like soldiers who'd survived the same war. "I read about what happened to you," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. "About the hypercar. I wanted to reach out, but I thought maybe you'd want privacy, that maybe I was the only one who'd been through this." "You're not alone," Caleb told her. "None of us are. That's what they counted on, keeping us isolated so we couldn't compare notes, couldn't build collective power. But that's ending now." They gathered the others who were willing to participate, 5 people whose lives had been systematically dismantled by the same corporate machinery. Together, they formed something defense tech industries had never anticipated, a chorus of witnesses who could corroborate each other's experiences and demonstrate a pattern of behavior rather than isolated incidents. The legal team drafted a comprehensive disclosure document. Not a lawsuit. Those were complicated by statutes of limitations and jurisdictional issues, but a detailed public accounting of what had happened. Names, dates, internal communications, documented lies, everything they'd found, compiled into a report that was simultaneously an indictment and a historical record. "Once we release this," the lead attorney warned, "there's no pulling it back. Defense tech will respond aggressively. The individuals named will deny everything and attack your credibility. This will consume significant time and resources, and success isn't guaranteed." "What does success look like?" Damien asked. "Best case? The truth becomes part of the public record. These people's reputations are damaged. Maybe some of them face professional consequences, though that's unlikely. Maybe defense tech changes its practices, though corporations are good at cosmetic reforms without structural change. Worst case, we get buried in litigation, your company's reputation suffers, and nothing changes except now you've made powerful enemies." Caleb looked at the other survivors gathered in the conference room. "Show of hands. Who's willing to take that risk?" Every hand went up. Not quickly, not easily, but with the grim determination of people who'd already lost everything once and knew they could survive it again. "Then we release it," Damien said. "Full disclosure. Let them come after us with everything they have. We'll be ready." The report went public on a Thursday morning in October, exactly 6 weeks after Caleb had fixed the quantum apex in an industrial wasteland. The timing was deliberate, late enough in the week that it would dominate the news cycle through the weekend, early enough that markets would have time to react. The response was immediate and explosive. Defense Tech Industries issued a statement within 2 hours, denying all allegations and characterizing the report as a coordinated attack by disgruntled former employees seeking financial gain. They threatened legal action against Cross Technologies for defamation and malicious interference with business relationships. Lawrence Hendricks, now CEO of Aerodynamics, held a press conference claiming the allegations were completely without merit and that his company stands behind its safety record and ethical standards. But the damage was already spreading. Journalists who'd been briefed in advance published companion pieces analyzing the documented evidence. Engineering forums exploded with testimony from other professionals who'd witnessed similar behavior at other companies. Hashtags trended. Congressional staffers reached out about possible oversight hearings. The military customer whose contract had prompted the original cover-up announced a review of its relationship with defense tech. And crucially, other survivors started coming forward. By Friday afternoon, Damien's office had received contact from 11 more engineers claiming similar experiences at defense tech or related companies. By Monday, that number had grown to 37. The pattern wasn't isolated. It was systemic, replicated across the entire defense and aerospace sector with depressing consistency. "This is bigger than we thought," Chen said, watching the news coverage from Damien's office. "This isn't just about defense tech. It's about an entire industry's culture." "Which is exactly why they're going to fight so hard to bury it," Caleb replied. He'd been doing interviews nonstop for 3 days, his face now recognizable enough that he couldn't walk through the building without being stopped. The moment this becomes about systemic problems rather than individual bad actors, every company in the sector has skin in the game. They'll close ranks. He was right. By Tuesday, the Aerospace Industries Association issued a statement defending the sector's commitment to safety and ethical employment practices while carefully not addressing any specific allegations. 3 major defense contractors announced new diversity and inclusion initiatives that felt suspiciously convenient in their timing, and Defense Tech's lawyers filed a lawsuit against Cross Technologies seeking $200 million in damages for defamation and tortious interference. Marcus appeared in Damien's doorway, his expression grim. "Sir, we need to talk about security. We've had 3 credible threats against the building in the last 24 hours. Someone spray-painted your home address on a defense contractor form." Caleb's getting death threats. Actual specific threats that mention where he was seen yesterday. Escalate protection for everyone involved in the disclosure. Caleb, Maria, the other survivors. I want them protected. Damien felt the weight of what they'd unleashed settling on his shoulders. And Marcus? Document everything. Every threat, every attempt at intimidation. It all becomes part of the record. The legal battle would stretch for months, he knew. Defense Tech had deep pockets and every incentive to make this as painful as possible. But something had shifted in the public conversation. The survivors weren't isolated victims anymore. They were witnesses to something larger, something that couldn't be dismissed as individual grievances. On Wednesday evening, Damien found Caleb in his office, staring out at the city lights. The man looked exhausted, the weight of the past weeks etched into his face. "You okay?" Damien asked. "I don't know. I wanted this. Wanted the truth public, wanted accountability. But I didn't anticipate how it would feel to watch my worst experiences become entertainment for people who'll forget about it in a week." Caleb's voice was raw. "Every interview, I have to perform my trauma. Prove it was real enough, painful enough, unjust enough. And even then, half the comments are people saying I must have done something to deserve it. You don't have to keep doing interviews. We can shut that down." "No. Because between the people who dismiss me and the people who want to weaponize my story for their own agendas, there are a few who actually hear what I'm saying, who start questioning their own complicity in similar systems. That's worth the cost." He turned to face Damien. "But I need you to understand something. This fight, it's going to last longer than the news cycle. Defense Tech will wait for public attention to fade, then they'll grind us down with legal attrition. The real question is whether you're still committed when this stops being a feel-good story and starts being expensive and tedious." "I'm committed. Not just to winning this specific fight, but to the larger project, the Talent Recovery Innovation Center, the system changes, all of it. Prove it." Caleb's challenge was direct. "Show me what you've built while we've been fighting this legal battle. Show me the 15 positions you promised were launching in the first quarter. Show me that you're capable of doing the boring, unglamorous work of actual change while the spotlight is on something more dramatic." Damien realized with uncomfortable clarity that he'd let the Defense Tech fight consume all his attention for the past 3 weeks. The Talent Recovery Innovation Center had continued its planning work, but he'd been absent from those meetings, distracted by the larger spectacle. "You're right," he admitted. "I got caught up in the fight and lost sight of the building. That's exactly the mistake you warned me about. So fix it. Tomorrow morning, first thing, I want a status meeting on the center. Not in a month. Not when the lawsuit settles. Tomorrow. Because if we're going to actually change how this industry works, we need to do it while people are paying attention, while we have leverage and momentum. Once the news cycle moves on, we'll have missed our window." The next morning, Damien convened the entire implementation team. Yolanda had the status report ready. They'd screened 87 candidates through their partner organizations, conducted first-round assessments with 43, and were ready to make offers to 12 individuals who demonstrated both skill and readiness for the program. "Why 12 instead of 15, Damien asked. "Because we're being careful," Yolanda explained. "We want to ensure adequate support systems for each person. Rushing to hit numerical targets helps our press releases but doesn't serve the people we're hiring." "No," Caleb interjected. "You're being cautious because you're afraid of failure. And that caution is exactly the kind of gatekeeping that keeps people locked out. How many of the 3 you excluded had the technical skills required for the positions?" Yolanda hesitated. "All of them had the skills. but their circumstances were more complex. One has a felony record, one is currently in transitional housing with stability concerns, one disclosed ongoing mental health treatment that might require accommodation. So you excluded them for being too complicated, for not fitting neatly into corporate comfort zones. Caleb's voice was hard. This is what I meant about the system replicating itself. You think you're being responsible, but you're just finding new reasons to exclude the people who need this most. We have to balance compassion with operational reality, Yolanda said defensively. If someone isn't stable enough to succeed, then we provide the stability they need instead of using instability as a disqualification. That's the entire point of the support systems we built. Caleb turned to Damien. This is the test. Right now, do we hire all 15, including the complicated cases, or do we retreat to comfortable candidates who look more like traditional employees? Every person in the room was watching Damien. He could feel the weight of the choice, the easy path that minimized risk versus the principled path that honored their stated commitments. We hire all 15, Damien said firmly, including the 3 Yolanda flagged, and we document everything carefully, not to justify excluding people in the future, but to learn what support systems actually need to look like for complex circumstances. Yolanda, work with the support team to structure individualized plans for each hire. If someone needs more intensive case management, we provide it. If someone needs flexible scheduling for mental health appointments, we accommodate it. We committed to doing this differently. That means embracing complexity, not screening it out. Yolanda looked uncertain, but nodded. Understood, sir. We'll have offers ready by Friday. The 15 new hires started the following Monday. Damien made a point of being present for each orientation, learning their names, hearing abbreviated versions of their stories. Each person carried histories of disruption and survival, job loss, medical crises, family dissolution, addiction recovery, criminal records for nonviolent offenses, years of homelessness or near homelessness. Every story was different. The common thread was systematic exclusion from opportunities that would have let them rebuild. Marcus watched the orientations with barely concealed anxiety, probably running threat assessments on each new employee. Chen participated directly, immediately drawing 3 of the hires into an engineering project that needed their specific expertise. And Caleb moved between groups like a bridge between worlds, equally fluent in corporate professionalism and survival street knowledge. By the end of the first week, they had their first test case. One of the new hires, Jerome Williams, had to miss 2 days because his transitional housing situation fell through and he needed time to secure alternative arrangements. HR flagged it as a potential attendance issue. He notified us in advance, Damien said when Marcus brought it to his attention. He communicated openly about the situation. He's dealing with exactly the kind of instability we said we'd accommodate. What's the problem? The problem is precedent, Marcus said carefully. If we allow flexibility for some employees that we wouldn't allow for others, we're creating liability issues. Equal treatment under policy. Then we change the policy to allow that flexibility for everyone. Make it standard that life circumstances sometimes require adjusted schedules. And as long as people communicate honestly, we work with them. That's not preferential treatment. That's human-centered management. That's going to create operational complications. Good. I'd rather have complicated operations and functional humans than streamlined operations and people falling through cracks. Damien paused. Marcus, I need you to understand something. Every policy you're worried about violating was written to serve a system that failed people like Jerome. If we're serious about change, we can't keep treating those policies as sacred. We have to be willing to break them when they conflict with doing right by people. Marcus looked profoundly uncomfortable, but eventually nodded. I'll work with HR to revise the attendance policy. The second week brought a different challenge. One of the new engineers, Lisa Chen, had ideas for improving the Quantum Apex's cooling system based on her previous experience in aerospace manufacturing. She presented them to the engineering team in a morning meeting. Her suggestions were technically sound and potentially significant, but the presentation didn't go well. Lisa's communication style was direct to the point of bluntness, shaped by years in industrial environments and survival situations where politeness was expensive. Several senior engineers bristled at what they perceived as presumption from someone who'd just started. The meeting ended awkwardly, with Lisa clearly frustrated and the engineering team muttering about respect and hierarchy. Chen brought it to Caleb and Damien that afternoon. We have a culture clash problem. Lisa's brilliant, but she's coming in hot, and the team isn't responding well. I need to know how to handle this without either silencing her or letting it poison team dynamics. What did she say that was actually wrong? Caleb asked. Nothing. Her technical analysis was sound, but the way she said it, she called one of the senior engineers' designs wasteful and short-sighted. That's not how we communicate here. Why not? Caleb's question was genuine. If a design is wasteful and short-sighted, why is stating that fact treated as a communication failure rather than a technical assessment? Because we have professional norms about how feedback is delivered. We couch criticism in diplomatic language. We consider people's feelings and egos. You mean you prioritize comfort over truth, and you're asking me to teach Lisa to do the same thing, to sand down her directness until she's acceptable to people who've never had to fight for every scrap of professional respect. Caleb shook his head. No. The team needs to adjust to her, not the other way around. Her communication style comes from environments where politeness doesn't build credibility. Results do. If the engineers are more offended by her tone than interested in her ideas, that's their problem to solve. That's not realistic, Chen protested. We can't just tell senior engineers to get over their hurt feelings. Why not? You'd tell Lisa to get over hers if she complained about being dismissed or condescended to. The difference is that your senior engineers hold structural power and feel entitled to comfortable working conditions. Lisa doesn't have that luxury. Caleb looked at Damien. This is another test. Do we require people from non-traditional backgrounds to assimilate into existing culture, or do we let them reshape that culture by being themselves? Damien thought about the engineering teams he'd built over 15 years, about the careful dance of professional courtesy that was really just a way of maintaining hierarchies, about how many brilliant ideas had probably been lost because someone didn't phrase them diplomatically enough. Chen, set up a team meeting. I want everyone who was in that morning session present, and I'm going to tell them directly that they need to examine their assumptions about what professional communication looks like and why they're more comfortable with polite inadequacy than blunt excellence. The meeting was tense. Several senior engineers clearly felt attacked or undermined. But Damien held firm, and slowly, grudgingly, the team began to engage with Lisa's actual ideas rather than their feelings about her delivery. By the end of the session, they'd incorporated 3 of her suggestions into the next design iteration. After everyone else had filed out, Lisa approached Damien and Caleb. I appreciate you backing me up, but I need you to know, I'm not going to change who I am to make people comfortable. I've spent too many years learning that softening myself doesn't actually buy me respect. If that's a problem, I should know now. It's not a problem, Damien assured her. It's exactly what we need, people who refuse to shrink themselves to fit into existing boxes. That's how we actually change organizational culture instead of just talking about it. Lisa studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, then I'm going to keep pushing. But fair warning, it's going to keep being uncomfortable, for everyone, including you. I'm counting on it, Damien replied. By the end of the first month, they had both success stories and struggling cases. 3 of the 15 hires were thriving unambiguously, excelling technically, adjusting well, already making measurable contributions. 7 were progressing steadily with varying levels of support needs. 4 were encountering significant challenges, housing instability, health crises, interpersonal conflicts, the grinding difficulty of trying to rebuild professional identity while still dealing with survival trauma. And 1, a machinist named David Torres, disappeared. He'd been doing well for 3 weeks, showing up reliably, producing excellent work, engaging positively with the support team. Then he missed a Monday shift without calling, didn't respond to calls or texts. His emergency contact, a friend at the shelter where he'd been staying, hadn't seen him in days. Marcus treated it as a security concern. HR treated it as an attendance violation. The support team treated it as a crisis requiring intervention. Damien and Caleb went looking for him themselves. They found David 5 days later in a different part of the city, sleeping rough under an overpass. He looked haunted, the progress of the past month stripped away like it had never happened. David, Caleb said gently, approaching slowly so as not to startle him. We've been looking for you. Are you hurt? Are you safe? David's eyes focused on them gradually, recognition dawning. I couldn't do it, he said, his voice rough. I thought I could, thought I was strong enough. But being back in that world, following schedules, dealing with people who don't understand, it broke something. I'm not ready. I'm sorry. I failed you. You didn't fail us, Damien said, kneeling beside him despite the fact that his suit would be ruined. The system failed you by not providing enough support. That's on us, not you. I can't go back. Okay, you don't have to, but let us help you get stable first. Medical check, safe place to sleep, no pressure about work, just stability. Caleb's voice carried understanding forged from experience. I've been where you are, David. I know what it feels like when the weight becomes too much. And I'm telling you, stepping back isn't the same as giving up. Sometimes survival means retreating to fight another day. They got David to a crisis stabilization center, made sure he had immediate support, and stepped back to give him space. The entire leadership team gathered that evening to process what had happened. This is what I was afraid of, Yolanda said quietly. We moved too fast, didn't have adequate systems in place. Now we have someone who's worse off than when we started. Is he worse off? Caleb challenged. He tried. He got 3 weeks of stability and professional engagement. He learned that the door isn't permanently locked, just that this particular attempt didn't work. That's information. That's dignity. The alternative was staying on the streets wondering if he was capable of more. Now he knows he is, and also knows he needs different support structures than we provided. That's not failure. That's learning. But what do we tell the other new hires? Chen asked. They're going to see one of their cohort disappeared and probably wonder if they're next. We tell them the truth, Damien said, that this work is hard, that we're learning as we go, that David's struggle doesn't reflect on anyone else's prospects, and that we're committed to improving our support systems based on what we learn from every situation, including this one. The honesty resonated. The other 14 hires responded not with fear but with solidarity. Several shared their own near-breaking moments, times when they'd almost walked away but hadn't because of specific supports or interventions. The conversation revealed gaps in the program that hadn't been visible before. They adjusted, added more flexible check-in protocols, created peer support networks, built in more explicit pathways for people to take breaks without feeling like they were failing, acknowledged that recovery wasn't linear and employment stability couldn't be forced on arbitrary timelines. And 3 weeks later, David called. He wasn't ready to return to work yet, but he wanted to stay connected, wanted to know the door was still open when he was ready, wanted to be part of the peer support network, even if he couldn't fully participate in employment right now. That's the measure of success, Caleb told the team when they discussed whether to keep David in the program. Not whether everyone succeeds on our timeline, but whether we create conditions where people can try, struggle, recover, and try again without being permanently excluded. That's what second chances actually mean, the ability to have third and fourth and fifth chances too. By the end of the first quarter, they'd learned more than any corporate training could have taught them. About the complexity of trauma, about how structural barriers replicated themselves in subtle ways, even in programs designed to eliminate them. About the difference between helping people and actually transferring power to them. But they'd also proven something fundamental, that the system could be different, that brilliance existed in overlooked places, that people society had discarded could not only contribute, but could reshape organizational culture by refusing to shrink themselves to fit existing molds. The Talent Recovery Innovation Center wasn't perfect. It probably never would be. But it was real. And it was growing. And it was beginning to change how cross-technologies understood its own possibilities. And somewhere in the broader industry, other companies were watching, some with hostility, others with curiosity. All of them forced to reckon with the question Caleb and Damien had made unavoidable. If a homeless man could save a hypercar with a pencil and emergency sealant, what other genius was society wasting because it refused to look past conventional markers of worth? The answer, it turned out, was everywhere. The hard part was having the courage to actually see it. The lawsuit from Defense Tech Industries landed like a sledgehammer 4 months into the Talent Recovery Innovation Center's operation. $200 million in claimed damages, allegations of defamation spread across 47 pages of legal prose, and a motion for preliminary injunction that would have forced Cross Technologies to retract the disclosure report and issue a public apology. The message was clear: submit or be destroyed. Damien's legal team gathered in the main conference room on a gray January morning, their expressions ranging from determined to terrified. The lead attorney, Robert Chen, no relation to the engineer, laid out their strategic options with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing a difficult operation. They're going for maximum pressure, Robert explained, spreading documents across the table. The damages claim is deliberately inflated to force settlement negotiations. The injunction motion is designed to silence you before the story gains more traction, and they filed in a jurisdiction where the judge has historically favored corporate defendants in defamation cases. This is textbook intimidation litigation. What are our chances if we fight? Damien asked. Honestly? 50-50 at best. Truth is an absolute defense to defamation, and we have strong documentation. But Defense Tech has unlimited resources and a legal team that specializes in grinding opponents into submission through attrition. Even if we win, we're looking at 18 months minimum of discovery, depositions, motions. Conservative estimate of legal costs is somewhere between $8 and $12 million. Caleb, sitting at the far end of the table, laughed without humor. So the system works exactly as designed. Tell uncomfortable truths and get bankrupted by legal fees regardless of whether you're right. That's not justice. That's economic violence dressed up in procedure. It's the reality we're operating in, Robert said carefully. My job is to give you clear-eyed assessment of risks and options. We can fight this and probably win on the merits, but the cost will be significant, financially, operationally, and in terms of leadership attention. The Talent Recovery Innovation Center will suffer if you're spending half your time in depositions. They're counting on that, Maria Santos said. She'd joined Cross Technologies full-time after the disclosure report, taking a position as senior advisor on accountability initiatives. This lawsuit isn't really about winning, it's about making the cost of truth-telling so high that nobody else tries it. If we settle or back down, every other potential whistleblower learns the lesson. Speaking up will destroy you even when you're right. Damien looked around the table at the assembled group, lawyers, engineers, the survivors who'd come forward, all of them now targets of a coordinated legal assault. He thought about the easier path, the one where he'd never stopped at that chain-link fence, never listened to Caleb, never started down this road of uncomfortable accountability. We fight, he said finally. All the way. No settlement that requires retracting truth. No apologies for documentation that's accurate. If they want to spend $8 million trying to silence us, we'll spend $12 million making sure the truth stays public. That's going to affect your quarterly earnings, Robert warned. The consortium invested based on certain financial projections. Legal costs at this scale will impact your ability to meet those targets. Then I'll explain to them that sometimes doing the right thing is expensive. If they pull funding over that, we'll find other investors. Damien's voice was firm. Yep. But I'm not abandoning these people or this work because Defense Tech wants to make an example of us. We knew this would be hard when we started. Hard doesn't mean wrong. The legal battle consumed the next 6 months in ways that were both dramatic and brutally tedious. Depositions stretched across weeks. Damien recounting the hypercar incident in excruciating detail, Caleb reliving his professional destruction, the other survivors testifying to patterns of retaliation and cover-up. Defense Tech's attorneys were aggressive, probing for inconsistencies, trying to discredit testimony by highlighting employment gaps and personal struggles that were direct results of their clients' actions. The low point came in March during Caleb's deposition. Defense Tech's lead attorney, a woman named Margaret Thornton, who'd made a career of defending corporate malfeasance, spent 6 hours systematically attacking Caleb's credibility. His homelessness was portrayed as evidence of instability, his lack of continuous employment as proof of inadequacy, his passion for accountability as vindictiveness masquerading as principle. "Mr. Mercer," she said with acid sweetness, "isn't it true that you've struggled with depression and anxiety since your termination from Defense Tech?" "Yes. That's what happens when your career is destroyed and your reputation is systematically shredded. Mental health struggles are a consequence of the harm your client inflicted, not evidence that the harm didn't occur. And isn't it true that during your period of homelessness, you had multiple interactions with law enforcement?" "I was homeless. Police harassment comes with that territory. I was never charged with anything because I wasn't doing anything illegal. Existing while poor isn't a crime, though your client seems to think it should be. Mr. Mercer, your hostility is noted. Let me ask you directly. Isn't this entire disclosure report motivated by personal vendetta rather than genuine concern for safety or accountability? Caleb had leaned forward then, his exhaustion and anger barely contained. You want to know my motivation? My motivation is that your client destroyed 7 people's careers that we know about, and probably dozens more that we haven't documented yet. My motivation is that Lawrence Hendricks is still running a major aerospace company despite knowingly endangering human lives. My motivation is that the system that enabled all of this is still operating exactly as designed, crushing anyone who threatens quarterly profits with inconvenient truths. So yes, I'm motivated. I'm motivated by the fact that if we don't hold these people accountable, they'll keep doing it. And the next Caleb Mercer won't even get the chance I got. They'll just be erased completely. The deposition had been suspended shortly after, with Margaret claiming Caleb was being uncooperative. In reality, she'd gotten exactly what she wanted: footage of an angry black man that could be edited to make him look unreasonable or threatening. It was a trap they'd walked into, despite knowing it was there. Damien found Caleb afterward in one of the empty conference rooms, staring out at the city with hollow eyes. I gave them ammunition, Caleb said without preamble. Lost my composure. Let them get under my skin. Now they'll use those clips to paint me as the angry ex-employee with an axe to grind. You told the truth. That's not ammunition, that's testimony. The truth doesn't matter if it's delivered in a way that lets people dismiss it. I know that. I've lived it, and I still couldn't keep it together. His hands were shaking slightly. This is what they do, Damien. They find your trauma, your anger, your justified rage at injustice, and they weaponize it, make you look unstable so they can avoid addressing whether you're right. Then we address it head on. In our legal briefs, in our public communications, we acknowledge that yes, you're angry. Yes, this is personal. And yes, that doesn't make the documentation any less accurate or the pattern any less real. Damien moved to stand beside him. You know what Margaret Thornton didn't ask you? Whether the internal emails we submitted were authentic, whether the safety reports were accurate, whether the timeline of your termination matched their own records. She didn't ask because she knows the answers would hurt her case. So instead, she attacked your credibility as a person. That's not strength. That's desperation. Doesn't feel like desperation. Feels like watching the same machinery that crushed me 15 years ago gear up to do it again. Except this time you're not alone. This time you have resources, documentation, and a platform. This time the machine doesn't get to operate in darkness. Damien's voice was steady. I know it's hard. I know every deposition feels like reliving the original trauma. But we're winning, Caleb. Slowly, expensively, painfully. But we're winning. Defense Tech's stock has dropped 11% since we filed. 3 of their major customers have initiated reviews of their contracts. Lawrence Hendricks is facing shareholder pressure. The truth is having consequences even while they're trying to litigate it into silence. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, You ever regret it? Stopping at that fence? Opening that gate? Everything that came after? Every day, Damien admitted. Not because it was wrong, but because it's so much harder than I imagined. I thought changing systems meant building new programs and hiring overlooked people and making speeches about justice. I didn't understand that real change means getting your hands bloody in legal battles and watching good people get re-traumatized and spending millions of dollars just to establish that truth matters. He paused. But regret doesn't mean I'd choose differently. It just means I finally understand the cost of principles when they conflict with power. That's more honest than most people in your position would be. I learned from a good teacher. You've never let me be comfortable with easy answers, not going to start lying to you about hard ones. They stood there in silence, watching the city move through its evening rhythms, people heading home from work, lights coming on in apartment buildings, the ordinary choreography of lives being lived while they fought battles most people would never know about. There was something both isolating and clarifying about it. The preliminary injunction hearing happened in April, in a federal courthouse that felt designed to intimidate. Defense Tech brought an army of attorneys in expensive suits. Cross Technology's team was smaller but fierce, led by Robert Chen, and supplemented by 3 advocacy organizations that had filed amicus briefs supporting their right to speak. The judge, Margaret Whitmore, was a Reagan appointee with a reputation for strict interpretation of defamation law. Defense Tech's attorneys argued that the disclosure report constituted a malicious attack on their client's reputation, that it caused irreparable harm to business relationships, and that Cross Technologies should be immediately enjoined from further publication or discussion of the allegations pending trial. Robert countered with the documented evidence: internal emails, safety reports, testimony from multiple witnesses, the pattern of retaliation that crossed years and affected numerous individuals. He argued that truth was an absolute defense, that the report served a compelling public interest in safety and accountability, and that enjoining speech about documented corporate misconduct would set a dangerous precedent for whistleblower protections. Judge Whitmore listened impassively for 3 hours of arguments, asked pointed questions that gave no indication of her thinking, then took the matter under advisement. The wait for her ruling felt interminable. Meanwhile, the Talent Recovery Innovation Center continued its work, though the lawsuit cast a long shadow. The program had expanded to 37 employees now, with varying levels of success and struggle. Some were thriving so completely that it was easy to forget they'd been homeless months earlier. Others were fighting daily battles with trauma, addiction, health crises, and the grinding difficulty of rebuilding lives while trying to maintain employment. The corporate culture was shifting in ways both positive and uncomfortable. The new hires brought different communication styles, different expectations about hierarchy and professional norms, different tolerance for bullshit that had previously gone unchallenged. Some of the established employees adapted well, finding the disruption refreshing. Others struggled with feeling displaced or uncertain in an environment that no longer operated by familiar rules. Lisa Chen had become something of a folk hero among the engineering team, not because she'd softened her approach, but because her blunt technical assessments kept proving correct. She'd identified 4 significant design flaws in existing projects, proposed solutions that saved hundreds of thousands in potential failures, and established herself as someone whose judgment was worth the discomfort of her delivery. Other engineers were starting to adopt her directness, realizing that diplomatic language often masked inadequate thinking. But success stories were balanced by ongoing struggles. 2 more employees had left the program, one to enter intensive addiction treatment, another because the daily demands of professional employment were simply more than they could handle given their current circumstances. The support team worked to maintain connection with both, ensuring they knew the door remained open if and when they were ready to return. And then there was the case of Robert Jackson, a brilliant mechanical engineer who'd lost his career to a felony conviction for a nonviolent drug offense. He'd been doing excellent work for 3 months when a routine background check update flagged his record in a way the initial screening hadn't. Corporate policy, written long before the Talent Recovery Innovation Center existed, required immediate termination for anyone with a felony conviction involving controlled substances. The policy existed for good reasons: insurance requirements, customer contract stipulations, liability concerns. It was also exactly the kind of blanket rule that perpetuated the exclusion they were supposedly fighting against. Marcus brought it to Damien's attention with obvious reluctance. "Sir, I know this is going to be a difficult conversation, but we have a compliance issue with Robert Jackson. His felony conviction violates our standard employment policy. Legal is saying we need to terminate immediately, or we risk voiding our liability insurance." "What was the conviction?" Damien asked. "Possession with intent to distribute. 10 years ago. He served 3 years, completed parole successfully, has been clean since. But the policy doesn't distinguish between types of felonies or time elapsed." Damien felt anger rising in his chest. "So we're supposed to fire someone who's doing excellent work, who's rebuilt his life, who represents exactly the kind of second chance we claim to support, because of a policy written to protect corporate interests over human dignity?" "I'm not defending the policy. I'm telling you what legal says we're required to do to maintain compliance." "Then we change the policy, and we tell legal that compliance with unjust rules is not more important than honoring our commitments to people." "That's not simple, sir. The insurance requirements are negotiable. Everything is negotiable if you're willing to pay for it." Get me a meeting with our insurance carrier. We're going to renegotiate our policy to allow case-by-case evaluation rather than blanket prohibitions. And if they won't budge, we find a different carrier. Marcus looked skeptical. That could cost significantly more in premiums. Then it costs more. The alternative is firing Robert Jackson and proving that all our talk about systemic change was just performance. I'm not doing that. Damien's voice was firm. This is exactly what Caleb warned me about. The moment when principles conflict with convenience and we have to choose whether we actually meant what we said. The insurance negotiations took 2 contentious weeks. The carrier initially refused to modify the blanket prohibition, citing risk assessment models and industry standards. Damien held firm, eventually finding a different insurance company willing to work with individualized evaluation protocols in exchange for higher premiums and additional oversight procedures. It cost Cross Technologies an extra $400,000 annually. It kept Robert Jackson employed. When Damien told Robert he wasn't being fired, the man had actually wept. Not just from relief, but from the shock of a system bending to accommodate him, rather than demanding he contort himself to fit its requirements. I've spent 10 years being reminded that one mistake defines my entire life, Robert said, his voice shaking. Every job application, every background check, every time I have to explain the gap in my resume, and you just paid $400,000 to say that's not true, that I'm more than the worst thing I've ever done. I don't know how to process that. You don't have to process it. You just have to keep doing the excellent work you've been doing. Damien paused. And Robert, this wasn't charity. This was investment. You're worth $400,000 in annual premiums and then some. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise. The Robert Jackson case became a turning point internally. Other policies started being examined with fresh eyes. Education requirements that had no relationship to job performance, experience requirements that excluded career changers, interview processes that favored polished performance over genuine capability. Each policy had seemed reasonable in isolation. Collectively, they formed an architecture of exclusion that operated invisibly until someone like Caleb or Robert or Lisa forced it into visibility. In May, Judge Whitmore issued her ruling on the preliminary injunction. The opinion was 73 pages of dense legal analysis that ultimately came down to a simple conclusion. Defense tech industries had failed to demonstrate that the disclosure report was false or made with actual malice. Truth remained an absolute defense to defamation, and the documentation provided by Cross Technologies met the evidentiary threshold for protected speech. The motion for preliminary injunction was denied. Defense Tech could continue their lawsuit, could demand discovery and take depositions and fight every procedural battle available. But they couldn't silence the report or force its retraction. The truth was now permanently part of public record. The response was immediate and electric. Media coverage exploded. Other engineers from other companies started coming forward with their own stories of retaliation and cover-up. Congressional committees announced oversight hearings into industry practices. Professional organizations that had been quietly uncomfortable with the status quo suddenly found courage to demand reforms. And Defense Tech's stock dropped another 8%. We're winning, Maria said at the emergency celebration gathering Damien called the day the ruling came through. Not just in court, but in the broader conversation. People are paying attention. The industry can't pretend this is isolated anymore. Don't celebrate too hard, Caleb cautioned. This was one battle. Defense Tech will appeal, we'll drag this out, we'll keep trying to make it expensive enough that we give up. And even if we win completely, even if Lawrence Hendricks faces actual consequences, the system that elevated him is still intact. We've exposed one piece of machinery. We haven't dismantled it. So what's next? Damien asked. Caleb pulled out a folder he'd been carrying, placed it on the table. Inside were sketches and calculations, the kind of technical documentation that had once been his professional language. Remember when I told you I had patent ideas worth more than your hypercar? Ideas I'd developed over 3 years on the streets because my brain wouldn't stop engineering even when I had nowhere to work? I remember. I want to develop them, not under Cross Technologies' intellectual property agreements, but as an independent research division where I retain ownership and creative control. And I want to bring in other survivors, people like Maria, like Robert, like the dozen engineers we've connected with who have brilliant ideas, but no platform to develop them. We build a parallel innovation structure that proves genius exists outside traditional corporate hierarchies. That's ambitious and potentially competitive with cross-technology's own research. It is, which is why I'm asking if you're willing to fund something that doesn't directly benefit your company, that might even create intellectual property you can't access or control. That's pure investment in human potential with no guaranteed return. The challenge was clear. Everything they'd built so far operated within Damien's corporate structure under his ultimate control. What Caleb was proposing was something truly independent, a transfer of power and resources with no strings attached, no ownership stake, no mechanisms for ensuring the investment served cross-technology's interests. It was the logical next step. It was also terrifying. How much funding are we talking about? Damien asked. $5 million for the first year. Covers lab space, equipment, stipends for researchers, legal support for patent filing, operational overhead. No expectation of product development or commercialization on any particular timeline. Just pure research. That's asking me to write a check for $5 million with no return on investment. Yes, that's exactly what I'm asking, because everything else we've done, no matter how revolutionary it feels, still operates within frameworks that prioritize your benefit. The Talent Recovery Innovation Center exists under your corporate umbrella. The employees we hire become your workforce. Even the lawsuit serves your interests by establishing your company as a leader in accountability. All of it ultimately reinforces your power and resources. Caleb's gaze was unflinching. If you're serious about transferring power rather than just sharing it temporarily, you have to be willing to give up something with no guarantee you'll get it back. That's what systemic change requires. People with resources voluntarily diminishing their own power to elevate others. The room went quiet. Everyone was watching Damien, waiting to see if the principles they'd been fighting for could survive this ultimate test. Damien thought about the hypercar dying in an industrial wasteland. Thought about the moment when he'd had to choose between pride and pragmatism, between control and trust. Thought about every comfortable certainty that had been dismantled over the past 8 months. $5 million, he said finally. Committed for 3 years, $15 million total. You maintain complete creative and intellectual property control. Cross Technologies gets no ownership stake, no board seats, no oversight except financial accountability reporting required by law. And I want one thing in return. What's that? I want you to succeed so completely that it makes me irrelevant. I want you to build something that proves brilliant innovation doesn't need billionaire benefactors or corporate structures. I want you to make me obsolete. Damien smiled, and it was genuine. Because if you can do that, it means we actually change something fundamental, and that's worth more than maintaining my centrality to the story. Caleb studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. Deal. But Damien, when we succeed, and we will, you don't get credit for it. This won't be a story about the generous CEO who funded independent research. This will be about brilliant people finally getting resources they should have had all along. Can you live with that? I can learn to, and if I struggle, I expect you to call me out on it. They shook. Around them, the assembled group erupted in applause and excited chatter about possibilities. But Damien felt something else, a strange mix of loss and liberation. He'd just agreed to make himself less central to the work he'd helped initiate, had voluntarily given up control and credit in ways that contradicted every instinct his success had taught him. It felt uncomfortable and right in equal measure, which, he was learning, was usually a sign that he was actually changing rather than just performing change for an audience. The Independent Research Division, eventually named the Mercer Innovation Collective in recognition of its founder, launched that summer. Caleb recruited 7 researchers initially, all survivors of various forms of professional exile, all carrying ideas they'd been unable to develop through traditional channels. They took over a warehouse space in the same industrial district where the hypercar had nearly died, turning it into a laboratory that looked nothing like corporate research facilities. The first project they undertook was finishing the work Caleb had started with the nanobond compound, the graphite sealant mixture that had saved the quantum apex. But instead of developing it for high-end automotive applications, they focused on disaster response scenarios. How could similar principles be applied to emergency infrastructure repair? Could temporary bonding compounds help in earthquake zones or conflict areas where permanent repairs were impossible? Could the approach be simplified enough for non-experts to use in crisis situations? It was research driven by human need rather than market potential. And it was brilliant. Defense tech industries continued their lawsuit through the summer and into fall, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. Two of the company's board members resigned under shareholder pressure. Lawrence Hendricks was forced to step down as CEO, though he retained a consulting position that everyone knew was face-saving fiction. The company settled quietly with three of the survivors, paying undisclosed sums in exchange for non-disparagement agreements that notably didn't include admissions of wrongdoing, but also didn't include denials. The legal battle with Cross Technologies ground on, but with declining intensity. Both sides knew how it would end. Eventually, Defense Tech would drop the suit or settle for nuisance value, having accomplished their real goal of making the process expensive and painful enough to discourage future disclosures. Damien was fine with that. The truth was public, the consequences were real, and the cost had been bearable. By October, a year after the hypercar incident, the landscape had shifted dramatically. The Talent Recovery Innovation Center had placed 63 people in positions across Cross Technologies and was fielding inquiries from other companies wanting to replicate the model. 3 other major corporations had launched similar initiatives, though with varying levels of genuine commitment versus public relations theater. Industry conferences featured panels on second chance hiring and accountability in engineering culture. The conversation had fundamentally changed, but the real transformation was harder to quantify and more important than any metric could capture. It was visible in the way Robert Jackson walked through the Cross Technologies building with his head up, no longer expecting to be questioned or ejected. It was present in the staff meetings where Lisa Chen's blunt assessments were treated as valuable rather than threatening. It was evident in the steady stream of people who contacted the Talent Recovery Innovation Center asking if there might be space for them, for their ideas, for the potential they'd been told was worthless. Damien marked the anniversary quietly, without press releases or celebration. He drove to the industrial district, parked near the chain-link fence where everything had changed. The film crew's equipment was long gone. The warehouse behind the fence had been leased by the Mercer Innovation Collective, transformed from forgotten ruin into something purposeful. Caleb found him there, looking through the chain link at the space where a hypercar had nearly died and a partnership had been forged. "Feeling nostalgic?" Caleb asked, coming to stand beside him. "Feeling grateful and overwhelmed and uncertain whether we've actually changed enough or just made ourselves feel better while systems continue operating fundamentally unchanged. Both are true. We've changed some things genuinely. Real people living better lives, real consequences for real harm. But the machinery that enables exploitation is vast and we've barely touched most of it. That's the reality of systemic change. You don't flip a switch and fix everything. You do difficult work that improves some things while other things remain broken, and you keep doing it anyway because the alternative is accepting that brokenness is inevitable. That's not a very inspiring vision. It's an honest one, which is more valuable than inspiration." Caleb turned to face him directly. "You asked me a few months ago if I ever regretted accepting your offer that day. I didn't answer completely, so here's the full truth. Yes, I regret how hard it's been. I regret the depositions and the public scrutiny and watching my trauma become entertainment. I regret that we haven't fixed everything and probably never will. But I don't regret trying. I don't regret choosing to build rather than just survive. And I don't regret trusting you enough to take the risk, even though trust has hurt me before. I'm glad you did. Trust me, I mean. Even though I didn't deserve it. You earned it. Not by being perfect, but by being willing to be uncomfortable and uncertain and wrong. By choosing principles over convenience when it would have been easier to do otherwise. That's what trustworthiness actually looks like. Not the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to learn from them and keep trying." They stood there in the October afternoon watching the Mercer Innovation Collective researchers visible through the warehouse windows, working on projects that might change industries or might lead nowhere, but that represented something precious either way. The chance to try, to fail, to learn, to try again without being permanently exiled for imperfection. "You know what the best part of all this is?" Damien said finally. "It's not the lawsuit victory or the program success or even the lives that are different now. It's that I'm standing here having a conversation with my partner and friend, and a year ago I was ready to have him arrested. That's the real change. Not in systems or policies, but in my ability to see what was always there. You didn't become worthy of attention when you fixed my car. You were always worthy. I just wasn't capable of seeing it. And now? Now I'm learning. Still failing regularly, still operating from assumptions I don't even recognize until someone points them out. But learning, that's something. Caleb smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way that was becoming more common, but still felt miraculous when it happened. Yeah, it is something, not everything, but something, and sometimes something is enough to build on. They walked back toward their cars, toward the evening that was settling over the city, toward whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. Behind them, through the chain-link fence, researchers worked in the space where industrial ruin had been transformed into possibility. Ahead, the road stretched uncertain and difficult, and full of work still to be done. But they'd walk it together. And that made all the difference. The call came on a Thursday morning in late November, 18 months after the hypercar incident. Damien was in a budget meeting when his assistant interrupted with unusual urgency. Senator Patricia Moreno's office was on the line, requesting an immediate conversation. The senator chaired the Commerce Committee and had been one of the most vocal advocates for the industry accountability hearings that the defense tech disclosure had triggered. Damien stepped into the hallway, accepted the transfer. Senator Moreno, this is unexpected. Mr. Cross, I'll be direct. We're finalizing witness lists for our January hearings on corporate accountability in the defense and aerospace sectors. I want you and Caleb Mercer to testify, not as adversaries to the industry, but as examples of what accountability can look like when companies choose transparency over cover-up. Damien felt his chest tighten. Congressional testimony meant national spotlight, meant every detail of their journey examined under hostile questioning, meant opening themselves to attacks from industry representatives who'd be defensive and well-prepared. It also meant an opportunity to cement the changes they'd fought for into policy and practice beyond cross-technology's walls. Can I discuss this with Caleb before committing? Of course. But Mr. Cross, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about telling your story. We have evidence of similar retaliation patterns at 17 other major contractors. Your willingness to go public created space for others to come forward. Now we need you to help us turn that testimony into actual reform. Without your voices, this remains an interesting news cycle that changes nothing structurally. With them, we might actually force the industry to operate differently. After the call ended, Damien found Caleb in the Mercer Innovation Collective warehouse, working with 2 researchers on a prototype emergency repair system for water infrastructure. The project had grown from theoretical exploration into something with real humanitarian applications. They were in discussions with 3 international aid organizations about field testing. Congressional testimony, Damien said without preamble. Senator Moreno wants us to appear at the accountability hearings in January. It would be national coverage, hostile questioning from industry-friendly representatives, probably attempts to discredit everything we've built. What do you think? Caleb set down the prototype carefully, his expression unreadable. I think it's terrifying. I think it's necessary. And I think we need to bring the others, Maria, Robert, Lisa, everyone whose story is part of this. Not just you and me as representatives, but actual survivors speaking for themselves. Otherwise, it becomes another narrative about heroic individuals instead of systemic problems. Moreno said she wants witnesses who can speak to solutions, not just problems. She specifically mentioned our work as an example of what accountability looks like in practice. Then we better make sure what we've built can withstand that level of scrutiny. Because you know defense tech and their allies will use every second of their questioning time to tear us apart, to find the failures and struggles and imperfections we've had, and weaponize them as evidence that alternative approaches don't work. Caleb paused. We need to be honest about our failures, Damien. Not defensive or apologetic, but clear-eyed. The testimony can't be a sales pitch. It has to be truth, messy, complicated, imperfect truth that still demonstrates something better is possible. They spent the next 6 weeks preparing, not just crafting testimony, but documenting everything they'd learned with brutal honesty. The successes were real. 63 people employed through the Talent Recovery Innovation Center with retention rates that actually exceeded traditional hiring programs, once proper support systems were in place. The Mercer Innovation Collective had filed patents on 3 breakthrough technologies, all developed by engineers the industry had discarded. Cross Technology's reputation had strengthened rather than suffered from their transparency, attracting both talent and investment from people who wanted to work for a company with demonstrated values. But the failures were equally real and needed acknowledgement. 8 people had left the program unable to maintain employment despite extensive support. 2 had relapsed into addiction. 1 had died, a heart attack at 47, decades of stress and survival finally exacting their toll. The support systems they'd built were expensive and difficult to scale. The cultural tensions within Cross Technologies remained significant, with ongoing conflicts between traditional employees and new hires who refused to assimilate into existing norms. "If we're going to testify, we tell all of it," Caleb insisted during a preparation session. "We don't hide the deaths or the relapses or the people who couldn't make it work. Because those aren't failures of individuals, they're evidence of how deep the damage goes when systems crush people for years. Pretending it's easy to fix does a disservice to everyone still struggling," Maria added her perspective. "And we need to be clear about what success actually means. It's not about everyone achieving conventional career trajectories. It's about people having dignified options regardless of their circumstances. David Torres hasn't returned to full-time employment, but he's stable, he's housed, he's part of our peer support network, and he's alive. That's success, even if it doesn't fit traditional metrics." They assembled a coalition for the testimony, Caleb and Damien as the primary witnesses, but supported by Maria, Robert, Lisa, and 3 other program participants who'd agreed to share their experiences. The legal team prepared them for hostile questioning. The communications team developed materials that contextualized their work within broader industry patterns. And slowly, painfully, they built a narrative that was honest about both transformation and limitation. The night before they were scheduled to fly to Washington, Damien received an unexpected visitor. Marcus Webb appeared at his door looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Sir, I need to tell you something before tomorrow. Something I should have said months ago but didn't have the courage." "Come in." Marcus entered, remained standing despite Damien's gesture toward the chairs. "When you first decided to let Caleb through that gate, when you started building the Talent Recovery Innovation Center, I thought you were making a catastrophic mistake. I thought you were letting ideology override pragmatism, that you were going to destroy everything you'd built chasing impossible ideals. I ran background checks looking for disqualifying information. I documented every incident that might support termination. I was basically building a case for why this whole initiative should be shut down." Damien felt anger flash through him, forced it down. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I was wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong in degree, fundamentally wrong about what makes organizations strong and what constitutes genuine security risk. I spent months watching for threats and missed the actual transformation happening. People like Robert and Lisa and Maria, they didn't weaken the company. They made it more resilient, more creative, more honest, and I actively worked against that because I was more committed to my assumptions than to evaluating reality." Marcus finally met his eyes. "Tomorrow you're going to testify before Congress, and I need you to know that if they ask about internal opposition or resistance, I was part of that. I'm not going to let you be blindsided by questions I could have prepared you for. And I'm not going to let my silence make you look like you had universal support when the truth is messier." "What changed your mind?" "Caleb did. About 3 months ago, he asked to meet with me privately. I expected accusations or confrontation. Instead, he asked me to teach him about security protocols and risk assessment frameworks. Said he wanted to understand my perspective, why I saw threats where he saw potential. We spent 6 hours going through scenarios, and I realized he wasn't trying to eliminate security concerns. He was trying to help me distinguish between actual threats and discomfort masquerading as risk assessment." Marcus pulled out a document, handed it to Damien. "So I wrote this. It's a comprehensive assessment of the Talent Recovery Innovation Center from a security and risk management perspective. It acknowledges real challenges, higher support costs, more complex HR situations, some increased liability exposure. But it also documents that none of the threats I was worried about materialized. No theft, no sabotage, no security breaches. Just complicated humans doing excellent work while managing difficult circumstances. The risks I imagined were projections of my own biases, not evidence-based threat assessment. Damien read through the document, felt something unknot in his chest he hadn't realized was there. You're giving me ammunition for the testimony. I'm giving you the truth, which is what this whole thing has been about, right? Telling uncomfortable truths even when it's expensive or inconvenient? Marcus's expression was rueful. You and Caleb have been doing that from the beginning. Seemed like it was past time I joined you. Thank you, Marcus. For the honesty, and for the document, and for being willing to change your mind. That takes more courage than maintaining certainty. Yeah, well, Caleb would probably say courage is just acknowledging you were wrong and doing better. Turns out that's harder than I thought. The congressional hearing room was designed to intimidate. High ceilings, formal wood paneling, elevated dais where senators looked down on witnesses, cameras positioned to capture every micro-expression. Damien had testified before Congress twice previously on technology policy issues, but those had been friendly forums where he'd been treated as an expert. This felt different, more adversarial, more consequential. Senator Moreno opened with a comprehensive statement laying out the scope of the investigation. 17 companies, 34 documented cases of retaliation against engineers who raised safety concerns, patterns of behavior spanning 3 decades. The numbers were staggering when presented collectively, transforming what had seemed like isolated incidents into clear evidence of systemic rot. Then she turned to Damien and Caleb. Mr. Cross, Mr. Mercer, thank you for being here today. I'd like to start with a simple question. When did you first realize that the aerospace and defense industry had a culture that punished truth-tellers? Caleb leaned toward his microphone. Senator, I realized it 15 years ago when I reported a safety concern and watched my career get systematically destroyed as a result. But the real realization came later when I understood that what happened to me wasn't an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed. Companies don't accidentally retaliate against whistleblowers. They do it deliberately because it's cheaper than fixing problems, and because they've correctly calculated that most people won't fight back effectively. And Mr. Cross, when did you realize this? Honestly, Senator, about 18 months ago when a homeless man fixed my broken hypercar, and I realized I'd been complicit in the same systems that destroyed his career. I'd benefited from industry practices I'd never examined closely. I'd hired from the same pools everyone else did, accepted the same credential requirements, trusted the same reputation mechanisms. It took a crisis to make me see that brilliance was being wasted systematically, and I'd participated in that waste without even knowing it. Senator James Hardwick, a Republican from South Carolina known for industry-friendly positions, jumped in. Mr. Cross, that's a touching story, but let's talk about practical reality. Your company has spent approximately how much on this Talent Recovery Innovation Center? Approximately $47 million over 18 months, Senator. That includes direct employment costs, support systems, facility modifications, and legal expenses defending our right to speak truthfully about industry practices. $47 million to employ 63 people. That's over $700,000 per person. How is that economically sustainable? How does that not prove that these alternative approaches are just expensive idealism that no company can actually afford? Damien had prepared for this question. Senator, that math is misleading in several ways. First, it includes legal costs from defending against Defense Tech's retaliatory lawsuit. Those are one-time expenses, not ongoing operational costs. Second, it includes initial infrastructure investments that benefit all employees, not just the 63 we hired through the program. Third, it doesn't account for the value generated. 3 patents filed, multiple design improvements that saved us millions in potential failures, and significant improvements in organizational culture that increased retention across the company. But surely you'd acknowledge this isn't scalable. Most companies can't afford $47 million for 63 hires. Most companies already spend enormous sums on recruitment, retention, legal defense, and managing the consequences of inadequate safety practices. We're just allocating those resources differently, toward prevention and support, rather than damage control and litigation. And Senator, I'd invite you to consider the alternative cost calculation. What's the economic impact of systematically excluding thousands of talented people from productive employment? What's the cost of preventable safety failures? Because engineers are afraid to speak up. 47 million sounds expensive until you calculate the cost of maintaining the current system. Caleb added, and Senator, we're not arguing every company needs to replicate our exact approach. We're arguing that the current system, where one mistake or one instance of speaking truth can permanently exclude someone from their profession, is both morally wrong and economically wasteful. There are hundreds of ways to do this better. We've shown one path. Others will find different ones. The key is acknowledging the problem exists and committing to solving it rather than defending systems that clearly don't work. Senator Moreno redirected. Let's talk about those systems. Mr. Mercer, you've now connected with 34 other engineers who experienced similar retaliation across 17 different companies. What patterns have you observed? Caleb pulled out documentation they'd prepared. The pattern is remarkably consistent, Senator. An engineer identifies a safety concern or data integrity issue. They report it through proper channels. Initially, they're thanked or told it's being reviewed. Then the environment changes, they're excluded from meetings, their work is scrutinized more heavily, they're moved to less desirable assignments. If they persist, they're terminated for ostensibly unrelated reasons, performance issues, cultural fit problems, reorganizations. Their reputations are quietly destroyed through whisper networks. Industry blacklists keep them from finding new positions, and within a year or two they're unemployable in the field, regardless of their expertise. Is this pattern documented? Extensively. We have internal emails, performance reviews that changed dramatically after safety reports were filed, and testimony from dozens of witnesses. The documentation is all in our submitted materials. Senator Hardwick interjected again. But Mr. Mercer, isn't it possible these people were actually underperforming, that their terminations were legitimate and they're using safety concerns as retroactive justification? Maria Santos leaned toward her microphone, her voice steel. Senator, I was a structural engineer with 15 years of experience and a spotless record when I reported that my company was falsifying stress test data. Within 3 months, I was fired for cultural fit issues. My performance reviews went from excellent to inadequate overnight. No specific failures were cited, just vague concerns about teamwork and attitude. I was replaced by an engineer with 5 years less experience who didn't question the falsified data. If that's legitimate business practice, then legitimacy has no relationship to truth or safety. The hearing stretched for 6 hours. Other senators asked about specific cases, about the economics of alternative approaches, about what policy changes might address systemic problems. Industry representatives testified after the cross-technologies delegation, defending their practices and arguing that safety was paramount while carefully not addressing the documented pattern of retaliation. The most powerful moment came near the end, when Senator Moreno asked Robert Jackson to speak. Robert had been quiet through most of the hearing, but when his turn came, he was unflinching. Senators, I'm a convicted felon. I served 3 years for drug distribution. That conviction has been the defining fact of my life for the past decade. More important than my engineering degree, more important than my work experience, more important than anything I've achieved since. Every background check reminds me that society has decided one mistake erases all other considerations. He paused, gathering himself. Mr. Cross could have made that same calculation. Our policy said people with my conviction history couldn't be employed. It was a clean rule, easy to apply, legally defensible. Instead, he paid $400,000 to change the insurance policy so I could stay employed. Not because I'm special, but because he'd committed to evaluating people as full humans rather than as policy checkboxes. Robert's voice grew stronger. That's what systemic change looks like. It's expensive and inconvenient, and it requires challenging rules that seem reasonable until you examine who they exclude and why. You're going to hear from industry representatives that current practices are fine, that the isolated cases of retaliation are regrettable but not systemic, that reforms would be too expensive or complicated. I'm here to tell you that maintaining current practices is more expensive. It just externalizes the costs onto people like me, people who become invisible to economic calculation because we've been defined as unemployable. The hearing concluded without clear resolution, but the impact rippled outward immediately. Media coverage focused on the personal testimonies rather than technical policy debates. Social media erupted with engineers sharing their own experiences of retaliation or near retaliation. 3 more companies announced reforms to their whistleblower protection policies before the day ended. And crucially, Senator Moreno announced draft legislation that would strengthen protections for safety whistleblowers and create civil liability for companies that engaged in retaliatory patterns. It was ambitious and probably faced long odds in a divided Congress, but it was movement in a direction that hadn't existed before. On the flight back to Detroit, Damien sat beside Caleb in exhausted silence for the first hour. Finally, Caleb said, "We told the truth. Not the comfortable version, not the inspirational narrative, the actual complicated truth. And they listened. That's something." Is it enough? Of course not, but it's progress. The industry can't pretend these patterns don't exist anymore. They'll fight against reforms, they'll find new ways to protect themselves, but they'll have to do it in public view now. That's the value of testimony like today. It removes the option of plausible deniability. Damien looked out at clouds passing beneath them. I keep thinking about what you said 18 months ago, that you didn't want to be my redemption story, that this couldn't be about a generous CEO saving people. Did today make this about you? Caleb finished the question. No, because you were honest about your complicity, because you centered the survivors' voices, not your own magnanimity, because you acknowledged failure and limitation instead of claiming we'd solved everything. That's the difference between redemption narrative and actual accountability. Redemption narratives make the powerful person the hero. Accountability narratives make the powerful person's recognition of their role in harm part of a larger story about systemic change. I'm still struggling with that distinction, with wanting credit for good things while also trying to be genuinely committed to transferring power. Yeah, you are. And you'll probably struggle with it forever, because that tension is real, and you've spent your whole life being rewarded for centrality. The work is staying aware of that tension instead of pretending you've resolved it. Caleb smiled slightly. You're doing the work, Damien, imperfectly, but genuinely. That's all anyone can do. The legislation Senator Moreno proposed didn't pass that session, but it created a framework for ongoing conversation, and pieces of it were incorporated into other bills over the following months. More significantly, the public attention created pressure on companies to reform voluntarily rather than wait for regulations. 7 major aerospace and defense contractors announced new whistleblower protection policies, independent safety review boards, and commitment to investigating patterns of retaliation in their own histories. The changes were real but limited. Some companies were genuine in their reforms, while others engaged in performative compliance that changed little. The industry associations fought against stronger regulations, arguing that voluntary approaches were sufficient. Conservative media outlets ran stories about political correctness, invading engineering, framing accountability as ideology rather than practical safety concern. But something had shifted permanently. The consensus that had allowed systematic retaliation to operate in darkness was broken. Engineers who witnessed problems had new language for describing them and new examples of people who'd survived speaking truth. The cost of retaliation had increased while the cost of transparency had decreased. At Cross Technologies, the Talent Recovery Innovation Center continued evolving. They'd placed 112 people by the 2-year mark, with retention rates that actually exceeded traditional hiring once they'd refined their support systems. The failures continued too. People who couldn't maintain employment, who relapsed into crisis, who needed more than the program could provide. But those failures were documented honestly, learned from, used to improve support rather than justify exclusion. The Mercer Innovation Collective became a model that others attempted to replicate with varying success. Caleb's team had grown to 15 researchers, all of them brilliant people the industry had overlooked or discarded. They'd developed 3 technologies that were now being licensed commercially, generating revenue that funded further research. But more importantly, they'd proven that genius existed outside traditional credentialing systems and could thrive when given resources without institutional control. The most unexpected development came in the 3rd year, when Defense Tech Industries quietly reached out about a settlement, not just for their lawsuit against Cross Technologies, they'd already dropped that in quiet defeat, but for something larger. They wanted to fund their own version of the Talent Recovery Innovation Center, and they wanted Caleb to consult on its design. The offer was simultaneously validation and suspicious. Damien and Caleb met to discuss it over coffee in the warehouse district where everything had started, now transformed but still carrying echoes of that original encounter. "What do you think their motivation is?" Damien asked. "Genuine reform or reputation management?" "Probably both. They're facing shareholder pressure, potential regulation, ongoing reputational damage. But that doesn't make the offer worthless. Even if they're motivated by self-interest, if it results in real opportunities for people who need them, that's still valuable." Caleb paused. "The question is whether I can design something they can't quietly dismantle when public attention fades. Whether I can build in accountability mechanisms that survive beyond their current PR crisis." "Do you want to do it?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to tell them to go to hell, that they don't get to buy back respectability after what they did. But another part thinks about all the engineers still locked out, still struggling, who might benefit if defense tech actually implements meaningful change. It's not about what they deserve. It's about what serves the people who need it most." They decided Caleb would consult, but on strict conditions: independent oversight of the program, mandatory transparency about outcomes including failures, built-in protections that prevented the program from being quietly defunded, and significant input from survivors in its design. Defense Tech agreed to all of it, probably calculating that the reputational benefit was worth the constraints. The result was imperfect, but real. Defense Tech's program was smaller than Cross Technologies, more constrained by existing corporate culture, less willing to challenge fundamental assumptions. But it existed, and it employed people, and it represented acknowledgement that change was necessary even from the company that had fought hardest against accountability. On the 3-year anniversary of the hypercar incident, Cross Technologies held a quiet gathering rather than a public celebration. The entire extended community assembled in the Mercer Innovation Collective warehouse: current employees, program alumni, people who'd tried and struggled, supporters who'd helped build what they'd created. No press, no cameras, just people who'd been part of the journey. Damien stood to speak, feeling the weight of everything that had changed and everything that remained frustratingly the same. 3 years ago, I was a different person running a different company with different priorities. I thought I understood innovation, thought I understood merit, thought I understood how to build something meaningful. And then my car broke down and a homeless man offered to help, and every certainty I had cracked open. He looked at Caleb, at Maria, at Robert and Lisa and David Torres, who'd made it back after all and was now working part-time while managing his ongoing recovery. "What we've built here isn't perfect. We've had failures and struggles and moments where we've replicated the exact patterns we were trying to change. But we've also demonstrated that alternative approaches are possible, that genius exists in unexpected places, that people deserve second and third and fourth chances, that accountability matters even when it's expensive, that systems can change if enough people commit to changing them." Damien paused, gathered himself. The easy thing would be to declare victory and stop, to say we've done enough, proven enough, changed enough. But that would be betraying everything we've learned, because the work isn't finished. The industry still systematically excludes people. Engineers still face retaliation for speaking truth. Brilliant minds still end up on streets because society has decided their potential isn't worth the inconvenience of accessing it. We've proven change is possible. Now we have to keep doing the unglamorous work of making it real. Caleb spoke next, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned every word through experience. 3 years ago, I was living under an overpass, convinced my expertise didn't matter because the world had decided I didn't matter. I'm standing here now not because I changed, but because someone finally saw what had been there all along. That's what this work is really about. Not transforming people, but removing the barriers that prevent their existing brilliance from being recognized. He gestured around the room. Every person here represents potential that almost got wasted. Some of us are thriving now. Some of us are still struggling. Some of us tried and couldn't make it work. And that's okay too, because trying matters even when it doesn't result in conventional success. What we've proven is that the system's definition of success is too narrow, too rigid, too willing to discard people for failing to overcome obstacles the system itself created. Caleb's expression was fierce. So here's what I want us to commit to for the next 3 years. We keep telling uncomfortable truths. We keep failing and learning. We keep challenging assumptions about who deserves opportunities and why. We keep building things that don't make sense according to traditional cost-benefit analysis, but make perfect sense when you value human dignity and potential. And we keep holding each other accountable, not to impossible standards of perfection, but to genuine commitments to do better even when it's hard. The gathering continued for hours, people sharing stories, reconnecting with those who'd moved on, planning future collaborations. At some point, Damien found himself standing with Marcus Webb, watching the community they'd helped create. "You were right to be suspicious of me at the beginning," Marcus said. "I was a security risk, just not the kind you thought. I was a risk to comfortable assumptions, to convenient certainties, to the idea that existing systems worked fine if people would just stop complaining about them." "You've changed," Damien observed. "I've learned. From you, from Caleb, from everyone who refused to shrink themselves to fit my expectations. Turns out real security comes from organizations honest enough to acknowledge their flaws and resilient enough to adapt. Everything I was doing to protect the company was actually making it more brittle." Marcus paused. "I wrote a paper about it. Got published in a security management journal. Apparently admitting you were fundamentally wrong about risk assessment is novel enough to be interesting." Damien laughed. "Only you would turn personal transformation into academic publication. Someone has to document this stuff. Otherwise, the next generation of security professionals will make all the same mistakes I did." As evening fell, people began drifting away to their lives that looked nothing like what they'd have been 3 years ago. Robert Jackson back to his apartment that he actually owned now, building equity and stability. Lisa Chen to her role as senior engineer, still blunt and still valued for it. Maria Santos to her work with 3 other companies trying to replicate what Cross Technologies had built. David Torres to his transitional housing and part-time position, still recovering but no longer alone in the struggle. Eventually, only Damien and Caleb remained, standing in the warehouse that had once been industrial ruin and was now something purposeful. "You never answered the question I asked you a year ago," Damien said, "about regret. Whether you regretted trusting me enough to try this." "I answered it partially. Here's the rest. I regret that it took a crisis to create opportunity. I regret that you needed your car to break down before you could see me. I regret that systemic change required so much pain and struggle and loss. But I don't regret the outcome. I don't regret being part of building something that proved different approaches were possible." Caleb smiled. "And I don't regret you, Damien. You're still learning, still imperfect, still capable of missing your own blind spots. But you're committed to the work. That counts for something." "Just something?" "Just everything that matters. The work is never finished. The systems are never fully changed. But the commitment to keep trying, to keep learning, keep failing better, keep building towards something more just even when success isn't guaranteed, that's what transforms individuals and organizations and eventually industries. You're doing that work. We're all doing it together. That's the real success story, not any individual achievement, but the collective commitment to sustained effort toward better possibilities." Damien looked around the warehouse, at the equipment and projects and evidence of human creativity finally given resources to flourish. Thought about the hypercar dying in this same district 3 years ago, about the choice he'd made to open that gate, about every difficult moment since then that had tested whether he'd meant what he'd claimed to believe. "I'm glad I stopped," he said finally. "Glad I listened. Glad I opened the gate. Not because it made me a better person, though maybe it did, but because it revealed a world I'd been living in without seeing. A world where brilliance exists everywhere if you're willing to look past credential and appearance and all the arbitrary markers we use to decide who matters. I can't imagine going back to not seeing that." You couldn't go back even if you wanted to. Once you see the systems that create and maintain exclusion, you can't unsee them. That's both the burden and the gift of this work. It ruins you for comfortable ignorance. Caleb moved toward the door, ready to leave. But the ruin is worth it, because on the other side of comfortable ignorance is the possibility of actually building something worth building. They walked out together into the November evening, the warehouse lights dimming behind them automatically. Somewhere in the city, people they'd hired were living lives that would have been impossible 3 years ago. Somewhere in Washington, legislation slowly wound through committees that might strengthen protections for truth tellers. Somewhere in other companies, other leaders were making choices about whether to replicate what cross-technologies had proven possible or to defend systems that prioritized comfort over justice. The outcome of all those choices was uncertain, but the possibility had been proven. The gate had been opened, and while systems might resist and powerful interests might fight back and progress might be slower than any of them wanted, the fundamental question had been answered. Different approaches were possible, and they worked when implemented with genuine commitment rather than performative gestures. 3 years after a hypercar broke down and a homeless man offered help, the real transformation wasn't in technology or policy or even in individual lives, though all of those had changed. The transformation was in recognition, in finally seeing what had always been there, in finally valuing what had always had worth, in finally building systems that served human potential rather than demanding humans contort themselves to serve systems. It was imperfect, incomplete, and absolutely necessary. And for Damien and Caleb and everyone who'd been part of building it, that was enough. Not enough to stop, but enough to know that continuing was worthwhile even when the path forward remained difficult and uncertain. Because that's what systemic change actually looked like. Not a moment of triumph where everything suddenly worked correctly, but sustained commitment to incremental improvement, to learning from failure, to building something better, even when better remained distant from perfect. They'd opened the gate, they'd walked through it together, and they'd keep walking, keep building, keep learning, keep failing forward toward possibilities that had seemed impossible 3 years ago, but now felt inevitable. The hypercar had been saved by genius society had discarded, and in being saved, it had revealed something more valuable than any technology. The recognition that humanity's greatest waste wasn't failed inventions or bankrupt companies, but brilliant minds systematically excluded from contributing their gifts. That recognition, once gained, could never be lost. And from it, everything else became possible.